My name is Emma Johnson, and I am 36 years old. The freezing Alaskan rain was hitting the glass of my fourth-floor office when the phone rang. It was a Tuesday in Anchorage, the kind of gray, relentless afternoon that makes the harbor look like a bruised landscape. I stood by the window staring at a logistics heat map for the Pacific fishery I run as supply chain director. I was watching cargo vessels thread their way through the inlet when my personal cell vibrated on the polished mahogany desk. The caller ID flashed a name I had not seen since high school, Jenna Croft. She owned a mobile notary business, now servicing the affluent neighborhoods out by the coastal trails. I picked it up, expecting a networking pitch. Instead, Jenna sounded out of breath. Her voice was tight with professional hesitation. "Emma, I should not be calling you," she said. "It is a breach of protocol. But I saw the paperwork, and I remember how you helped me pay for my textbooks back in college." I leaned back in my leather chair. The low hum of the servers in the adjacent room suddenly felt loud. "What paperwork, Jenna?" "Your parents," she said, the words spilling out fast. "Richard and Helen, they booked me for an emergency mobile signing at the Cook Inlet estate in an hour. They are transferring the deed." A cold knot formed at the base of my throat. The estate, the property I had financially anchored for the last 12 years. "Transferring it to whom?" I asked. "Your sister Jenna said. Only Sarah's name is on the new grant document. I just printed it. I assumed you knew, but your mother specifically asked if I was the only notary in the office today. She wanted to keep it quiet." I did not speak. I looked out at the sleet. The icy droplets traced jagged lines down the window pane. My parents were the kind of people who wore their respectability like expensive coats. They smiled at charity galas while privately treating me as their automated bank account. I was the responsible one, the glass child who absorbed their fiscal mistakes so my sister Sarah could continue playing the fragile favorite. But a deed transfer behind my back was not a mistake. It was a calculated theft. Welcome back to Grape Echo Stories. This is where we sit with the quiet women who finally stop apologizing, the ones who kept the peace until keeping it cost too much. Grab your coffee, get comfortable, and drop a comment telling me how old you are and where you are listening from. Be sure to subscribe. You should know who I am before I tell you what I did, because the two things do not match the way my family tells it. I build systems that do not fail. As a director of supply chain logistics, I move millions of tons of freight across the Pacific. I deal in margins, contracts, and ironclad agreements. My family knows none of this in any way that counts. To them, I am just the utility, the daughter who works too much, who never quite fits into their country club aesthetics, who fixes the leaks in the roof while they admire the ceiling. And now they were giving that roof away. What my parents did not know as they sat in their pristine living room waiting for a notary to arrive was that I had not just been paying their property taxes out of the goodness of my heart. 12 years ago, when they were drowning in debt, I bailed them out. But I made Richard sign a formal promissory note secured by a recorded deed of trust on the estate. They treated it as a temporary annoyance and entirely forgot about it. I never forgot. "Jenna," I said, my voice dropping to the register I used when a shipping container went missing, calm, level, devoid of emotion, "do not get in your car." "Emma, they are paying triple my usual rate for the rush," she started to say. "I am not asking you to lose a client," I interrupted, pulling up a digital file on my second monitor. "I am saving you from a malpractice suit. You cannot notarize a clear title transfer for that property." The stark black text of a legal recording illuminated my face in the dim office. "Why not?" she asked. "Because there is a cloud on the title," I said, "a registered recorded security interest tied directly to me. If you stamp that transfer, you are facilitating a fraudulent conveyance. They do not own the house free and clear, I do." The line went dead quiet. All I could hear was Jenna's shallow breathing and the weather striking the glass. "I will tell them my car broke down," Jenna finally whispered and hung up. I set the phone down. The screen faded to black. The immediate crisis was neutralized, but the piece was over. The trap had snapped shut, and I knew what was coming next. My mother would call, and she would try to use the one weapon she always used: guilt. 10 minutes later, my phone lit up again. Helen. I let it ring twice before answering. "The notary canceled," my mother snapped, skipping any greeting. Her voice was sharp and brittle. "We have a very important legal matter to attend to, and now everything is delayed. You know people in real estate, Emma. Find me someone who can get here today." I stared at the blinking cursor on my screen. "I already know about the deed transfer, Mom." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The silence stretched tight across the cell towers. When she finally spoke, her tone shifted from demanding to a practiced, wounded condescension. "It is family business, Emma. You have a husband who provides. Sarah has nothing. You need to be the bigger person and let this go." I did not argue. I did not yell. I just pressed the red button on my screen and ended the call. Let them try. The red call-ended screen faded to black, plunging my office back into the gray shadows of the Alaskan afternoon. I sat perfectly still. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the data servers through the wall. My phone buzzed again, vibrating against the mahogany desktop. I looked down, expecting another call. It was a text message from my mother. "We are a family, Emma. We take care of each other. Please do not make this difficult. Love you." Following the text were 3 bright red heart emojis. I stared at the glowing pixels. A chill crawled up the back of my neck. That text was a masterclass in performative maternal love. 10 minutes ago, she had coldly demanded I surrender my inheritance because my husband earned a good living and my sister did not. Now she was sending digital affection to paper over the cruelty. It was a calculated tactic designed to make me feel unreasonable. She wanted to paint me as the cold corporate daughter denying her warm, loving family. I did not reply. I unlocked my bottom desk drawer. The metallic click of the lock echoed in the quiet space. Inside sat a fireproof lockbox. I input the combination and lifted the heavy lid, pulling out a thick manila folder labeled Cook Inlet. People think wealth accumulation is about taking big risks. It is not. True wealth is about building impenetrable systems. It is about reading the fine print when everyone else is distracted by the sales pitch. My parents had never understood that concept. They preferred the illusion of wealth over the reality of it. 12 years ago, I was 24 years old and barely 3 years into my logistics career. I was working 80-hour weeks, saving every paycheck, living in a cramped apartment downtown. My parents were living in the Cook Inlet estate, hosting catered dinners. Then the tax authorities came knocking. Richard and Helen had ignored their property taxes for years, spending the cash on country club dues and imported cars to keep up appearances. They were facing an imminent tax foreclosure. My father invited me to the house, poured me a glass of expensive scotch, and asked for a temporary loan to tide them over. It was a staggering amount of money, every cent I had saved. He promised he would pay me back by the end of the year. He acted like he was asking me to cover the tab for lunch. I knew my father. I knew the money would never be returned if I just handed him a check. So I treated my parents the way I treat a high-risk vendor. I agreed to clear the tax deficit, but only if Richard signed a formal promissory note. More importantly, I had a lawyer draft a deed of trust tying the loan directly to the estate. Richard was offended. He scoffed at the paperwork. He signed the documents with a flourish of his expensive pen, dismissing my caution as bureaucratic paranoia. He treated the legal binding as a temporary annoyance, a silly hoop to jump through to humor his anxious daughter. He entirely forgot about the ink the moment the funds hit his account. But I recorded the document with the Anchorage County clerk that very same afternoon. It became a permanent scar on their pristine property title. A dormant trap waiting in the archives. For 12 years, that document slept. I paid the annual taxes through a blind limited liability company to ensure the property remained secure while the original loan accrued interest according to the strict terms Richard had blindly signed. I ran my fingers over the raised notary seal on the original parchment. The paper felt rough and substantial. This was the paper reality. It did not care about heart emojis. It did not care about family loyalty or guilt. It only cared about the math. My office phone rang, not my personal cell, but the encrypted corporate landline. I picked up the receiver. "Emma Johnson," I answered. Miss Johnson, this is Greg from Apex Title and Escrow, a voice said. He sounded stressed. He had the nervous energy that comes from being caught in a bad transaction. I recognized the company name. Apex Title was a strip mall outfit on the edge of town. They handled rushed closings, distressed properties, and clients who asked too few questions. Richard had wasted no time. After Jenna canceled, he had driven straight to a less scrupulous agent to push the deed transfer through. "How can I help you, Greg?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "I have your parents, Richard and Helen, sitting in my conference room," Greg said. "They are trying to execute a quitclaim deed to transfer their property to a Sarah Davis. They told me the property was unencumbered, but my underwriter just pulled the preliminary title report." I listened to the sound of papers shuffling on his end of the line. "We found a recorded deed of trust attached to the property," Greg continued. "The beneficiary is listed as your limited liability company. We cannot insure this title transfer, and we certainly cannot record a new deed unless we get a formal payoff demand from you and clear the debt. Your father insists it is a mistake. He says the debt was forgiven years ago." "He is incorrect," I said. I could hear muffled shouting in the background of Greg's office. Richard was losing his temper. The polished gentleman mask was slipping. "Can you confirm the status of the lien?" Greg asked, his voice tight. "The loan is active," I stated clearly. "The principal plus 12 years of accrued interest remains entirely unpaid. I will not authorize a release. If my parents wish to transfer the deed to my sister, they must satisfy the debt in full. I will email your office the payoff demand within the hour." There was a long pause. "What is the current payoff amount, Ms. Johnson?" Greg asked softly. I read the number off the spreadsheet I had updated that morning. It was a steep six-figure sum, a number my parents could not generate if they liquidated everything they owned. I heard Greg swallow hard. "I will convey that to your father," he said, and hung up. I set the receiver back in its cradle. A profound sense of cold satisfaction settled in my chest. My parents had tried to bypass my blockade by finding a desperate title agent. Instead, they had crashed face first into the airtight financial fortress I had meticulously constructed over a decade. They were trapped. The Cook Inlet estate was locked down. I stood up and walked back to the window. The freezing rain had turned to sleet, rattling against the glass like thrown pebbles. The initial wave of betrayal had passed, replaced by a sharp, calculating clarity. My parents were broke, I knew that. So why were they suddenly so frantic to give the house to my sister today? Transferring a multi-million-dollar asset to Sarah made no logical sense unless Sarah needed the asset to borrow against. Sarah had never worked a serious job in her life. She spent her days at the country club funded by her husband David. David was a real estate broker who wore custom suits and drove imported sports cars. He projected an image of boundless wealth. But a man with boundless wealth does not need his in-laws to secretly sign over their only remaining asset. My office phone buzzed again. The receptionist at the front desk announced I had visitors in the lobby. She sounded unnerved. They had bypassed the security gate. They did not wait to be escorted. The heavy glass door to my suite swung open. Sarah marched in, her face flushed red with anger. Behind her walked David. Even from across the room, I could smell his designer cologne. It was thick, expensive, and suffocating. It smelled like a man trying desperately to cover up the stench of intense fear. The real fight was about to begin. The heavy glass door closed with a soft pneumatic hiss, sealing the three of us inside my office. Sarah wore a beige cashmere coat that cost more than my first vehicle. She marched right up to my desk, planting her manicured hands flat on the polished mahogany surface. David lingered a step behind her. The air in the room shifted instantly. A potent wave of expensive cologne rolled over my desk. It was a heavy blend of sandalwood and crushed spices, sprayed with a generous hand. But beneath the sharp fragrance, my senses caught something else: stale sweat. The sour, unmistakable odor of raw panic. David was rotting from the inside out, and he had bathed in designer fragrance to hide the decay. David had always been the golden son-in-law. He arrived at family holidays driving imported cars with dealer plates. He handed out high-end cigars and dispensed unsolicited investment advice to anyone who would listen. He specialized in commercial real estate, flipping strip malls and office parks. He lived on leverage and projected an aura of untouchable success. My parents adored him. He was the charismatic charmer who made them feel adjacent to royalty. My mother loved to boast about his acquisitions at her charity luncheons. "Call the title company right now," Sarah demanded. Her voice was shrill, echoing off the acoustic panels lining my walls. "Call them and tell them you made a mistake. Tell them to clear the deed so we can finish our paperwork." I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice. I leaned back in my chair and observed them. My sister looked frantic. The pristine facade she usually maintained was cracking around the edges. Her hair was slightly windblown from the Alaskan storm outside. Her eyes darted around my office, taking in the executive furnishings with a mixture of disdain and intense envy. David stepped forward, trying to flash his signature salesman smile. The corners of his mouth trembled. "Emma, let us be reasonable," he coaxed. His tone dripped with forced warmth. "Your parents want to simplify their estate planning. You are interfering with their final wishes. We do not want to make a scene in your lovely corporate headquarters. We do not want your executives to think you are bullying your elderly mother and father over a piece of property. It would look terrible for your career." It was a veiled threat. They wanted to leverage my professional reputation against me. They thought I would cave to avoid office gossip. They severely misjudged how I operate. In logistics, when a supplier threatens a breach of contract, you do not negotiate. You audit their supply line. You dig into their financials until you find the weak point. I turned my attention away from their flushed faces and dragged my mouse across my dual monitors. My fingers danced over the mechanical keyboard. As a supply chain director, I have access to comprehensive macroeconomic databases. I track global market trends, shipping lane insolvencies, and commercial defaults every single day. I know how to find hidden data. It took me less than 40 seconds to bypass the private portals and access the municipal public records database for Anchorage and the surrounding boroughs. "Are you even listening to me?" Sarah snapped. She struck the desk with her palm. The sound cracked like a whip in the quiet room. "You have plenty of money. You do not need that house." "Mom and Dad gave it to me. It is mine." I kept my eyes on the screen as the search results populated. Rows of red text filled the monitor, painting a grim picture. Liens, judgments, pending litigation. "They did not give it to you," I said softly, reading the data. "They tried to give it to you because you asked for it, and you asked for it because David is drowning." The forced smile vanished from David's face. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking pale and sick under the fluorescent lights. He took a step forward. His hand reached out as if he could physically grab the information off my screen and crush it. David had leveraged his entire portfolio to purchase a defunct retail space downtown, hoping to rezone it for luxury condominiums. The Municipal Planning Commission denied his permits last month. That single regulatory decision turned his prized asset into a toxic liability. The high-interest bridge loans he used to finance the purchase were now calling for immediate repayment. 2 commercial plazas in the Matanuska-Susitna Valley are in active foreclosure, I read aloud, listing the brutal facts. 3 separate construction contractors have filed mechanic liens against your development firm for unpaid invoices totaling over $1 million. And there is a fresh filing from yesterday morning, a preliminary notice of commercial bankruptcy. I turned my chair to face them squarely. The pieces of the puzzle snapped together with terrifying clarity. "You do not want to live in the Cook Inlet house," I stated, staring directly into David's panicked eyes. "The property sits on a premium waterfront lot. It is unencumbered except for my security interest. You wanted my parents to sign the deed over to Sarah so you could immediately liquidate it. You were going to sell the family estate to the highest bidder tomorrow morning to cover your catastrophic commercial debts. You were going to render our parents homeless to save your own skin." Sarah's mouth opened and closed. She looked at David, searching for a denial. He was staring at the floor. A bead of sweat traced a line down his temple, cutting through the heavy cologne. The realization hit her. Not that her husband was a fraud. She likely already knew that part. The realization that hit her was that her easy payday had just evaporated. Her golden parachute was gone. She erupted. "It is our house!" Sarah screamed. Her voice cracked, abandoning any pretense of dignity. Her hands were shaking, the veins in her neck standing out against her pale skin. The contrast between her expensive clothes and her primal panic was striking. "You are just jealous. You have always been jealous that they loved me more. You are a cold, calculated machine, and you are trying to ruin my life. You cannot do this to us, Emma. We need that money." I stood up. I am 5 inches taller than my sister. In my tailored suit and heels, the height difference felt pronounced. I walked around the desk, keeping my expression flat. I am a machine, I agreed. My voice was a quiet murmur beneath her screaming. And you just tried to put your hand in the gears. I opened the heavy glass door and gestured to the hallway. A few junior analysts had peeked out of their cubicles, drawn by the noise. Sarah saw the audience and froze. Her social conditioning kicked in just enough to paralyze her. She could not bear to look ugly in front of strangers. David grabbed her elbow. His head was lowered. He pulled her out of the suite. He knew the fight was lost. They retreated down the corridor, leaving a trailing scent of expensive sandalwood and undeniable defeat. I closed the door and pushed the deadbolt. The lock engaged with a firm, satisfying click. I walked back to my desk, inhaling the filtered air from the vents, trying to clear the stench of their desperation from my office. I had exposed their true motive. I had broken their strategy. But cornered animals do not surrender. They change tactics. I sat down and reached for my coffee. Before the cup touched my lips, my cell phone illuminated. A ringing tone echoed in the quiet space. I answered. It was my father, Richard. His voice was frantic, breathless, and strained. He claimed Helen had just collapsed, clutching her chest. An ambulance was rushing her to the emergency room right this second. The next phase of their war had begun. The drive to Anchorage General Hospital took 20 minutes. The Alaskan weather had deteriorated into a punishing mixture of sleet and freezing rain. My windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the ice. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel tightly. For 36 years, I had been trained to respond to this exact stimulus. I was the fixer, the responsible daughter who absorbed the collateral damage of my parents' reckless choices. My internal conditioning screamed at me to fold, to write the check, to clear the title and save my mother from the stress I had allegedly caused. But my analytical mind, the part of me that managed international supply lines and audited multi-million-dollar freight manifests, remained cold and observant. The timing was too convenient. I parked in the emergency lot and walked through the sliding glass doors. The hospital smelled of harsh antiseptic and damp wool. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pallor over the waiting area. I found my father pacing near the triage desk. Richard looked disheveled. He had discarded his tailored suit jacket. His tie hung loose around his neck. When he saw me walking down the corridor, his eyes narrowed. He did not step forward to embrace me. "This is on you, Emma," Richard hissed as I approached. His voice carried down the quiet hallway, drawing the attention of a passing nurse. "You pushed her into this. Your mother has a fragile heart, and you stood there demanding ransom for the family home. You are killing her over a piece of real estate." I did not flinch. The guilt trip was predictable. It was the same tactic he used when I was a teenager, working summer jobs to pay for my own school supplies while Sarah received a new car. "Where is she?" I asked. My tone remained flat. "Room 4, Richard answered, pointing a trembling finger toward a row of curtained bays. "And if she does not recover from this stress, I will never forgive you." I walked past him and pushed the heavy fabric curtain aside. Helen lay on the narrow hospital bed. She looked frail. Her makeup was slightly smudged. An oxygen cannula rested beneath her nose. Wires trailed from her chest to a monitor mounted on the wall. She closed her eyes and let out a weak, shuddering breath when I entered. "Oh, Emma," Helen whispered. Her voice was thin and reedy. "Why are you doing this to us? We are your family." I stood at the foot of the bed. The lifelong urge to play the peacekeeper tugged at my chest. It is a hard instinct to kill. The desire to appease the people who raised you? But I am a data-driven executive. I do not deal in emotional narratives. I deal in metrics. My gaze drifted away from her tear-streaked face and focused on the telemetry monitor above her head. In my line of work, you learn to read readouts quickly. Heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen saturation. The green line tracing her cardiac rhythm was smooth, steady, and unbroken. Her pulse rested at a calm 72 beats per minute. Her blood oxygen was perfect. A person experiencing a genuine cardiac event or severe physiological distress does not present with textbook vital signs. A man in dark blue scrubs stepped through the curtain holding a digital tablet. It was the attending physician. I recognized his badge. Anchorage General is a primary medical hub, but it is still a local institution. As a director for the largest fishery on the western seaboard, I oversee the charitable supply chain donations to this exact facility. I have the hospital administrator on speed dial. Doctor, I said, stepping forward. I am Emma Johnson. I manage the Pacific Freight accounts. I believe you work closely with Marcus Thorne in administration. The physician paused. His posture straightened at the mention of his superior. Yes, Ms. Johnson, Marcus speaks very highly of your logistical support during the winter supply shortages. I offered a brief, polite smile. Could we step outside for a moment? I need a clear assessment of my mother's condition. He nodded and led me into the corridor, out of earshot. Richard tried to follow, but I held up a hand, halting him in his tracks. What is the diagnosis? I asked the doctor in a low voice. No sugarcoating. I need the raw medical data. The doctor looked at his tablet, then at me. He sighed, the professional discretion dropping just a fraction. Medically speaking, she is pristine. Her troponin levels are normal, no signs of ischemia, no cardiac damage whatsoever. She experienced a localized, self-induced panic attack, hyperventilation brought on by acute situational stress. We gave her a mild sedative and some oxygen for comfort. She could discharge right now and walk out to the car. Thank you, doctor, I replied. That is exactly what I needed to know. I turned back toward room 4. The pieces fell into place. The final shreds of my familial illusion burned away. They were weaponizing their own mortality. They were willing to fake a medical emergency, drag the hospital staff into their theater, and manipulate my fundamental human empathy just to steal my financial leverage. They were bankrupt in every sense of the word. I pushed the curtain aside one last time. The doctor had stepped away to update Richard. Helen was alone in the bay. She thought the room was empty. I watched in silence as the fragile, dying woman sat up briskly. The performative tears instantly dried up. The weak, shuddering breathing stopped. She reached over to her designer handbag, pulled out a compact mirror, and began checking her smudged mascara with a steady, practiced hand. The miraculous recovery of a cornered actress. She caught my reflection in her small mirror. Helen froze. The compact snapped shut. She quickly slumped back against the pillows, her hand fluttering to her chest as she tried to resume the gasping character. "Do not bother Mom," I said. The words fell like ice chips on the linoleum floor. "Emma," she stammered, abandoning the fake cough. "The doctor said I need rest. The stress you are causing is too much." "The doctor said you are medically pristine," I corrected her. "You had a panic attack because your secret deed transfer failed. You are acting, and you are a terrible actress." Helen dropped her hand. The fragile victim persona vanished, replaced by cold, calculating fury. Her eyes hardened. She looked exactly like Richard did when a deal fell through. "You ungrateful child," Helen hissed. Her voice was sharp and clear, devoid of any weakness. "We gave you everything. We raised you, and you humiliate us like this. You will release that property today." "I will not," I stated flatly. "I am leaving now. My security interest remains exactly where it is. You and Richard can figure out how to pay David's debts yourselves. Do not ever call me with a fake medical emergency again. Next time, I will send the billing department directly to your doorstep." I turned my back on her and walked out of the curtained bay. I strode past Richard in the hallway without offering a single word of comfort. He shouted my name, but I did not stop. I pushed through the sliding glass doors and stepped back into the freezing Alaskan storm. My phone buzzed in my pocket as I reached my vehicle. I ignored it. Emotional warfare had failed. They could not guilt me into submission, and they could not trick me with hospital theater. I started the engine and turned the heater on high. If emotional manipulation could not break my blockade, I knew exactly what they would try next. Richard would retreat to his study, pour a stiff drink, and look for a way to force my hand. He would look for a predator wearing a suit. He would hire an attorney to construct a legal bluff, and he would serve it to me on a silver platter. I drove straight home from the hospital parking lot. The Alaskan storm had worsened, turning the streets of Anchorage into a treacherous sheet of black ice. My windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the freezing rain. I gripped the leather steering wheel, my mind operating with cold, geometric precision. Emotional warfare had failed. My mother, faking a cardiac event, was their desperate attempt to bypass my logic with guilt. Because that theatrical performance fell apart, I knew exactly what they would try next. Richard would retreat to his oak-paneled study, pour a stiff scotch, and look for a way to force my hand through intimidation. My house sits on a quiet residential street nestled against the foothills. It is a modern structure, built of steel and tempered glass. I bought it with my own money. No family loans, no secret deeds, just honest equity earned through 80-hour work weeks managing international freight logistics. I had barely taken off my damp wool coat when the doorbell chimed. A man in a beige windbreaker stood on my front porch, holding a thick manila envelope. He asked to confirm my identity. I nodded. He handed over the packet and walked away into the sleet without another word. I locked the door and carried the envelope into my kitchen. I tore open the paper seal. The header on the first page bore the embossed logo of Sterling & Associates. They were a notoriously predatory estate litigation firm downtown. They specialized in bullying heirs, tying up probate courts for years, and bleeding estates dry through endless billable hours. Richard had hired a shark. The document was a formal notice of contestation. They were challenging the legal validity of my promissory note and the recorded deed of trust. The filing alleged that the transaction was an informal familial gift. It claimed the loan lacked proper consideration and was executed under undue influence, rendering it void under state law. Richard thought a formal legal threat would make me fold. He assumed I was a frightened daughter who would wilt under the heavy letterhead of a downtown law firm. He forgot who he was dealing with. I manage maritime law contracts. I negotiate cargo disputes with sovereign entities. A local estate bully did not intimidate me. I picked up my phone and dialed the managing partner of my corporate wealth management team. His name was Marcus. He handled the offshore trusts and complex tax shelters for the entire fishery board of directors. I told him my father was attempting to sever a recorded security interest using a predatory estate firm. Marcus did not flinch. He told me to meet them in his conference room the following morning. The mediation took place on the 40th floor of the tallest glass high-rise in Anchorage. The boardroom was a sterile expanse of polished marble and chrome. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the frozen inlet below. It was a corporate environment designed to make ordinary people feel very small. Richard arrived 10 minutes late. It was a classic power play. He walked into the boardroom flanking his attorney. Mr. Sterling wore a pinstripe suit that looked slightly too tight. His hair was slicked back with heavy pomade. My father wore his finest tailored wool jacket. Peeking from the breast pocket was his prized possession, a vintage gold fountain pen. That pen was a gift from a bankrupt oil tycoon my father used to play golf with decades ago. Richard brought it to every important meeting. He used it to sign checks he could barely cover. It was his ultimate symbol of manufactured prestige. He wielded it like a royal scepter, relying on the visual aesthetic of wealth rather than actual solvency. We sat across the vast marble table. Sterling opened his leather briefcase and spread his documents out with theatrical flair. He began his pitch. His voice was loud, patronizing, and dripping with unearned confidence. "Ms. Johnson, we are here to offer you a graceful exit," Sterling said. "Your claim on this estate is based on an unconscionable agreement. A father accepting financial help from his young daughter does not constitute a formal lending structure under state precedent. It is a gift. If you do not voluntarily release the lien today, we will drag this into Superior Court. We will freeze your assets and bury you in years of discovery." I sat perfectly still. I did not look at Sterling. I looked at Richard. My father sat tall in his ergonomic chair, his chin raised, looking incredibly smug. He believed he had won. He believed the expensive suit sitting next to him had frightened me into submission. Marcus opened a single, slim folder. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with the quiet, lethal precision of a man who bills $1,000 an hour and never loses. "Mr. Sterling," Marcus began, "your notice cites precedent regarding informal familial gifts. However, you failed to read the chain of title thoroughly. The funds did not originate from Emma Johnson's personal checking account. They were wired directly from a registered limited liability company, a corporate entity. Furthermore, Alaskan real property statutes are incredibly strict regarding recorded security interests. The promissory note includes a severability clause, an explicit schedule of compound interest, and was notarized by a state official. It is a commercial transaction. Sterling shifted in his leather chair. The smugness on his face faltered just a fraction. Marcus pushed a printed ledger across the marble table. In addition, Marcus continued, this corporate entity has paid the property taxes on the Cook Inlet estate for 144 consecutive months. Under state law, this not only validates the original loan, it constitutes an ongoing equitable interest. If you file a frivolous suit to contest a bulletproof commercial lien, we will countersue for tortious interference. We will seek punitive damages. And given the intense financial disclosures required for discovery, your client's impending insolvency will become public record. The atmosphere in the boardroom plunged below freezing. The polished marble suddenly felt like a tomb. Sterling stared at the ledger. He knew he was beaten. He was a predator, and predators do not waste energy attacking fortified bunkers. They look for easy prey. He closed his briefcase with a loud snap. Richard Sterling said, his voice dropping an octave, "We need to reevaluate our position. This is not the case you presented to me during our initial consultation." Richard turned pale. His jaw clenched tight. He refused to accept the reality of the situation. He reached into his tailored breast pocket and pulled out the vintage gold fountain pen. He snatched the hostile legal notice he had intended to serve me. "I am not reevaluating anything," Richard snapped. "We are proceeding. I am signing the notice of litigation right now. We will see you in court, Emma." He uncapped the gold pen with a dramatic flourish. He pressed the nib to the thick parchment paper. He dragged his hand across the signature line, expecting the smooth flow of dark ink to finalize his threat. Nothing happened. No ink stained the page, just a faint scratch marking the surface. Richard frowned. He shook the pen, tapping the gold nib against the marble table. A sharp metallic clink echoed in the silent room. He pressed down again, harder this time, trying to force his name onto the document. The nib scraped painfully across the paper, leaving nothing but a dry, empty groove. The ink had run dry. It was the perfect physical manifestation of his entire existence, a shiny, expensive exterior holding zero substance. His power was depleted, his resources were gone. He was trying to write checks his reality could no longer cash. Sterling reached over and pulled the paper away from my father. "Do not be a fool," Richard the lawyer hissed. "I am withdrawing my representation. I will send you the invoice for my retainer this afternoon. I expect it paid by Friday." Sterling stood up and walked out of the boardroom without looking back. Richard was left sitting alone on his side of the long table. He stared at the dry gold pen in his trembling hand. The humiliation radiated from him in palpable waves. He was on the hook for thousands of dollars in legal fees he could not afford to pay, and he was no closer to breaking my hold on the estate. Marcus closed his slim folder. I stood up, smoothing the front of my jacket. I looked down at my father. "You tried to bully me with a rented suit," I said quietly. "It was a bad investment." I walked out of the glass high-rise and stepped back onto the frozen Anchorage pavement. I had won the battle, but as I sat in my car waiting for the heater to warm the cabin, my phone buzzed with an email notification. It was an itinerary update regarding the upcoming Winter Fishery Gala. It is the most prestigious charity event of the season, a place where corporate reputations are minted and destroyed. I knew Richard well enough to understand the intense danger of a humiliated narcissist. If he could not defeat me in a private boardroom, he would try to destroy me in public. He would take the war to the one arena where logic and facts mattered less than malicious rumors and social status. The high society of Anchorage was about to become a battlefield. The Winter Fishery Gala is held every February in the grand ballroom of the premier downtown hotel. It is the undisputed pinnacle of Anchorage high society. For the shipping executives, local politicians, and maritime investors, it is a mandatory appearance. Deals worth millions of dollars are struck over plates of roasted caribou and glasses of imported French wine. Reputation is the only currency that truly matters in that room. I arrived at 8 o'clock wearing a tailored midnight blue gown that mirrored the frozen sky outside. I handed my wool coat to the attendant and walked down the sweeping grand staircase toward the ballroom. I expected the usual hum of corporate networking. I expected handshakes and polite inquiries about the upcoming salmon run. What I received instead was a localized freeze. As my heels clicked against the polished marble floor near the entrance, a group of prominent logistics brokers turned their backs simultaneously. A senior vice president from a rival firm, a man who usually greeted me with a warm embrace, offered a stiff nod and quickly steered his wife toward the buffet line. The air in the room felt heavy and uninviting. I paused by a towering ice sculpture near the entrance and observed the ecosystem. The sharp, rhythmic clinking of crystal champagne flutes thinly veiled the vicious, rapid-fire gossiping of the Anchorage elite. I watched their eyes dart toward me and quickly dart away. Voices lowered into hushed, urgent whispers behind manicured hands. The societal temperature had dropped to sub-zero. It took me less than 30 seconds to locate the source of the chill. Standing near the center of the room, beneath a glittering crystal chandelier, was my father. Richard had arrived early. He was dressed in a pristine tuxedo, holding court with a circle of influential equity partners and banking executives. His posture was commanding and tragic all at once. He was playing the role of the heartbroken patriarch. I picked up a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and moved closer, standing just behind a tall floral arrangement. I needed to hear the narrative he was spinning. "It breaks my heart," Richard said, his voice resonating with practiced sorrow. "We gave Emma every advantage. We paid for her education, we supported her career, and now that she has reached the top of her corporate ladder, she has lost her humanity. She is using a technicality to hold her own mother's home hostage. We are facing eviction because my daughter wants to liquidate our retirement to pad her investment portfolio." A collective murmur of sympathetic outrage rippled through his audience. One of the bankers shook his head in disgust. It was a masterfully crafted lie. Richard was painting me as a ruthless corporate monster, rendering her elderly parents homeless out of pure greed. And then he delivered the punchline. "But we will survive this," Richard declared, puffing out his chest. "We built a beautiful, unencumbered, debt-free estate on the inlet. We will not let one ungrateful child steal the legacy we intend to pass down to our family." I took a slow sip of my water. The dramatic irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. He was boasting about his debt-free estate while standing 50 feet away from the woman holding a six-figure recorded security interest against it. He was projecting extreme financial invulnerability to mask his total lack of solvency. He wanted to isolate me professionally and socially. He wanted to make me an outcast in my own industry, hoping the social pressure would force me to release the deed just to save my reputation. I do not shrink from pressure. In supply chain management, when a route is blocked by a storm, you do not turn the ship around. You chart a path directly through the ice. I set my glass down and scanned the ballroom. I did not need to address the crowd. I did not need to shout over the music or defend myself to the banking executives. I only needed to find the apex predator of the local rumor mill. I spotted her near the silent auction tables. Evelyn Mercer. Evelyn was the wife of a retired maritime judge. She held no official title in any company, but she possessed the most dangerous weapon in Anchorage, the undivided attention of every wealthy spouse in the city. If you told Evelyn a secret, it would be treated as verified gospel across 3 area codes before breakfast. I walked across the room, ignoring the icy stares directed at my back. I approached the auction tables with a serene smile. "Good evening, Evelyn," I said, stopping beside her to admire a donated landscape painting. Evelyn stiffened. She looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and deep social caution. "Hello, Emma. I am surprised to see you tonight, given the circumstances." I kept my gaze fixed on the painting. "What circumstances are those, Evelyn?" She lowered her voice, leaning in slightly. The scent of her expensive floral perfume was stifling. "Your father has been quite vocal this evening. It is a terrible tragedy when a family fractures over money. People are saying you are forcing them out onto the street. It is a tragedy," I agreed, my tone entirely even, "especially when the money in question does not belong to them." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. The bait was in the water. She could not resist a counter-narrative. "Whatever do you mean?" she asked. I opened my small silk clutch. "I do not attend high-stakes events without bringing insurance." I pulled out a single folded sheet of paper. It was a printed, certified docket summary from the municipal court pulled directly from the public record database that afternoon. I handed the folded paper to Evelyn. My parents are not facing eviction because of me, I said quietly. They are attempting to quickly transfer their real estate to my sister Sarah so her husband can liquidate it tomorrow. They are trying to save David from federal ruin. I am simply blocking the fraudulent transfer. Evelyn unfolded the paper. Her eyes scanned the dense legal text. The summary clearly listed David's development firm. It showed the 3 mechanic liens, the active commercial foreclosures, and the devastating preliminary notice of bankruptcy. The numbers printed on that page were staggering. It was irrefutable proof of total financial collapse. Evelyn gasped, her hand flying to her pearl necklace. David is bankrupt. He will be by Friday, I corrected her. He leveraged everything and lost. My father is spreading rumors about me tonight to distract this room from the fact that his golden son-in-law is sinking. They are desperate, and desperate people tell very tall tales. I took the paper back from her trembling fingers and slipped it into my clutch. Enjoy the dinner, Evelyn, I said. I walked away and took my assigned seat at a corporate table near the front of the room. The dinner service began. Waiters carried out heavy silver trays of roasted meats and winter vegetables. I watched the room dynamics shift in real time. Evelyn did not return to her seat immediately. She moved from table to table, whispering into the ears of her closest confidants. She pointed discreetly toward Richard. I watched the information spread outward like a ripple in a dark pond. The rhythmic clinking of champagne flutes changed frequency. By the time the dessert course arrived, the atmosphere had entirely inverted. The icy stares aimed at me had thawed, replaced by expressions of professional respect and quiet awe. The room understood exactly what had happened. I was not a greedy monster. I was a smart executive protecting her assets from a family of grifters. I glanced toward the center of the ballroom. Richard was standing alone. The banking executives and equity partners had quietly excused themselves from his circle. One of the shipping magnates caught Richard's eye and pointedly turned his back. The social exile was swift and merciless. Richard looked around the grand ballroom, his face flushed with profound humiliation. He locked eyes with me. I raised my coffee cup in a silent toast. He did not finish his dessert. He turned on his heel and marched toward the coat check, fleeing the gala long before the final speeches began. I enjoyed the rest of my evening. I secured 3 new shipping contracts and left the hotel feeling a deep sense of strategic satisfaction. But as my driver navigated the icy streets back to my house, a new unsettling thought crept into my mind. Richard and Helen had failed with guilt. They had failed with legal threats. They had failed to destroy me in the court of public opinion. Their conventional weapons were depleted. But my sister Sarah was different. Sarah did not fight in boardrooms or grand ballrooms. When Sarah wanted something she could not earn, she stole it from the shadows. The next attack would not be social. It would be a silent digital strike aimed straight at the heart of my financial infrastructure. The morning after the charity dinner brought a deceptive stillness to Anchorage. The sun barely crested the jagged peaks of the Chugach Mountains, casting long gray shadows across the ice-choked harbor. I sat at my mahogany desk, sipping black coffee and watching the digital heat maps on my monitor. The social exile of my father was a calculated victory, but I knew the silence would not last. My family did not possess the humility to retreat. They only knew how to pivot. Richard and Helen had exhausted their conventional strategies. They failed to weaponize guilt at the hospital. They failed to intimidate me with a predatory downtown lawyer. They failed to ruin my professional reputation among my corporate peers. Their overt attacks were neutralized. But my sister operated on an entirely different frequency. Sarah did not fight in public arenas. She avoided direct confrontation because it required courage and stamina. When she wanted something she felt entitled to, she waited until nobody was looking and took it from the shadows. I manage the digital infrastructure for a global supply chain. My daily operations require securing sensitive freight manifests, international customs data, and corporate banking routing numbers. I treat my personal limited liability company with the exact same military-grade encryption. Sarah is not a hacker. She does not know how to write code or bypass firewalls, but she possesses a much more dangerous tool for social engineering. She holds 36 years of intimate familial data. She knows the maiden names, the childhood street addresses, and the dates of every significant family milestone. She understands the psychological architecture of my past. I knew she would try to use that shared history as a skeleton key to unlock my financial portals. 2 days prior to the gala, I had a confidential meeting with Derek. He is the Chief Information Security Officer for my logistics firm, a man who speaks less than 10 words a day and views every digital interaction as a potential threat. I explained the situation regarding my family estate and the pending financial desperation of my brother-in-law. I told Derek I expected a localized cyber intrusion targeting the specific holding company that owned the Cook Inlet security interest. Derek did not ask personal questions. He simply nodded and built a trap. We constructed a digital honeypot. It was a segregated virtual server designed to mimic my private financial portal. It featured the same login screen, the same corporate logos, and the exact same user interface. Inside this phantom database, we placed a single fabricated file labeled as a formal deed release authorization. To a desperate person searching for a way out of crushing debt, it would look like salvation. The honeypot was rigged with a silent alarm. The moment an unauthorized user breached the login page, the server would trace the connection. It would harvest the intruder's internet protocol address, their physical device identification number, and their precise geographic location. I was reviewing a delayed shipping schedule from Seattle when the notification appeared. A small red banner flashed across the top of my secondary monitor. Unauthorized access attempt detected on external server alpha. I set my coffee mug down. The porcelain clicked softly against the wood desktop. My heart rate remained steady, but a cold focus settled over my thoughts. She was actually doing it. Sarah was attempting to steal the estate through digital forgery. I opened the secure terminal and watched the intrusion unfold in real time. Derek had routed a live viewing feed directly to my workstation. I could see the keystrokes being entered on the fake login portal. Sarah tried my primary email address, then she clicked the link for a forgotten password reset. The system prompted her with the primary security question. What was the destination of your childhood road trip in the summer of 1999? I watched the cursor blink on my screen. A moment later, the letters appeared one by one. Yellowstone. The answer was correct. My sister was sitting in her house using the memories of our family vacations to systematically dismantle my digital locks. The server presented the secondary security challenge. What was the name of your first pet? The cursor paused. The delay lasted for almost a full minute. I pictured Sarah sitting in her lavish living room, staring at her laptop screen. I wondered if she felt even a fraction of the heavy sorrow that accompanied that specific memory. When I was 9 years old, my father brought home a Siberian Husky puppy. We named him Ranger. Ranger was my constant companion. He slept at the foot of my bed and waited by the front window every day until I came home from school. When I was 14, Ranger developed severe bone cancer. My parents did not want to deal with the emotional burden or the veterinary bills. They went to a country club brunch and left me alone to sit with Ranger on the veterinary clinic floor while the doctor put him to sleep. I held his paw until his breathing stopped. It was my first experience carrying the weight of a painful responsibility while my family looked the other way. The letters appeared on the screen. Ranger. A sharp physical ache struck the center of my chest. It was the chilling realization that my sister had successfully bypassed the security wall by weaponizing the name of my deceased childhood dog. She was using a deep, intimate grief as a crowbar to pry open my vault. There was a specific kind of cruelty in leveraging shared nostalgia to commit a theft. It confirmed that she viewed every part of our shared past as an exploitable resource. The phantom server accepted the correct answers and granted her access. The screen transitioned to the dummy dashboard. I leaned forward, watching the activity logs populate. Sarah navigated straight to the document repository. She did not hesitate. Her mouse hovered over the file labeled Deed Release Authorization. She initiated the download. The moment the file transferred to her local hard drive, the honeypot snapped shut like a steel jaw. My terminal flooded with green text. The security program executed its tracing protocol. It bypassed her basic residential router and mapped the connection directly to the source. The system logged the external internet protocol address. It matched the residential grid for the affluent Anchorage subdivision where Sarah and David lived. The program dug deeper, pulling the unique media access control address of the physical machine. It identified a silver, ultra-thin laptop registered to Sarah Davis. I sat back and exhaled a slow, steady breath. The trap had worked flawlessly. This was no longer a messy civil dispute over a family inheritance. The moment Sarah used electronic means to bypass a security protocol and download a fraudulent financial document across state lines, she crossed a very rigid legal boundary. She had just committed federal wire fraud. Under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, her actions constituted a felony punishable by years in federal prison. I opened a secure folder on my desktop and saved the intrusion logs. I exported the geolocation data, the timestamp keystrokes, and the unique device identifiers into an encrypted file. I now held concrete, irrefutable proof of her crime. The power dynamic in this war had shifted permanently. I held the keys to her freedom. Sarah thought she had won. I knew she would open that fabricated file, print the fake release authorization, and attempt to forge my signature on the bottom line. She would try to present it to a title agent to clear the property deed, but the document was embedded with a digital watermark that rendered it legally void upon printing. It was useless paper. She would find that out the hard way when she tried to file it with the county clerk. The failure of her digital theft would send David into a blinding panic. His commercial creditors were calling in their loans. The mechanic liens on his abandoned development projects were maturing. He did not have time to wait for another forged document or another legal bluff. He needed cash injected into his accounts by the end of the week, or his entire empire would collapse into criminal bankruptcy. When cornered men run out of conventional options, they turn to the shadows. David could not sell the property with my legitimate recorded deed of trust blocking the title. But there is a dark secondary market in commercial real estate, a sector populated by ruthless, unregulated lenders who deal in clouded titles and distressed assets. David was about to leverage the Cook Inlet estate to a predatory private equity firm. He was going to borrow against the equity of a house he did not own, promising to clear the title post-closing. He was inviting corporate sharks into my family home, and I would have to intercept their auditors before they handed him the lifeline he so desperately needed. Thursday morning arrived with a biting chill that seeped through the insulated glass of my office windows. The failed digital heist from the previous night meant my sister held a useless piece of fabricated paper. Sarah and David were out of time. The traditional lending institutions had already closed their doors to them. His commercial creditors were circling like vultures over his failing development projects. I knew his history in the real estate sector. Before he started flipping suburban strip malls, he spent years brokering mezzanine debt. He understood the hidden architecture of the shadow banking system. When regulated banks lock you out, a desperate broker turns to predatory private equity firms. These shadow lenders operate far outside standard municipal banking regulations. They hide their capital behind offshore holding companies and complex corporate shells. They charge exorbitant interest rates and collateralize high-value assets with a ruthless mechanical efficiency. They do not care about family inheritance disputes. They do not care about ethical dilemmas or emotional pleas. They only care about securing a clear property title and extracting maximum financial return. At 10 in the morning, my encrypted office landline rang. It was a contact I had cultivated over years of managing international shipping lanes. His name was Harrison. He worked as a senior risk assessment officer for a boutique investment firm located in the downtown financial district. 2 years ago, I quietly rerouted a delayed cargo vessel carrying his firm's high-priority structural steel components. I saved his quarterly profit margin from a devastating shortfall. He owed me a substantial professional favor. He chose to repay it today. Emma Harrison said, keeping his tone hushed. A local broker named David is currently shopping a hard money bridge loan. He is using a premier residential property on the Cook Inlet as his primary collateral. He promised our underwriting department a clean, unencumbered deed by Friday. He claims the current owners are signing the estate over to his wife this afternoon. I listened to the steady rhythm of Harrison speaking. The puzzle pieces locked together. The firm is called Obsidian Holdings Harrison, continued. Their auditors are sitting in a leased boardroom on the 20th floor of my building right now. They are preparing the final term sheets and the funding disbursement schedules. David is scheduled to meet them at noon to sign the paperwork and finalize the transfer. I thanked Harrison for the intelligence and hung up the phone. Obsidian Holdings was notorious in the Alaskan financial sector. They preyed specifically on distressed developers who needed rapid cash injections. If they dispersed those funds to David, they would immediately place their own overriding lien on the Cook Inlet estate. Untangling a shadow equity firm from my family property would take years of expensive litigation in Superior Court. I could not let David sign those term sheets. I needed to kill the transaction before he even walked into the room. I assembled my corporate dossier. I printed a certified copy of the original deed of trust bearing the raised municipal recording seal. I included the comprehensive public records detailing the unpaid mechanic liens and the pending commercial bankruptcies threatening his development firm. Finally, I added a printed summary of the cyber intrusion logs from the previous night, outlining the federal wire fraud committed by his spouse. I placed the documents into a sleek leather portfolio. I draped my heavy wool coat over my shoulders and left my logistics hub. The drive into the financial district was agonizingly slow. Snowplows scraped the frozen asphalt, throwing bright orange sparks into the gray morning air. Commuters walked with their heads down, bracing against the bitter wind blowing off the harbor. The Anchorage skyline loomed ahead as a cluster of glass and steel, reflecting the bleak winter weather. I parked my vehicle in a subterranean garage and took the express elevator directly to the 20th floor. The reception area for the leased executive suites was deserted. I bypassed the empty front desk and walked with purpose down the carpeted corridor. The assigned boardroom door was made of thick, frosted glass. I pushed it open without knocking. Two men sat at the far end of a long, polished mahogany table. They were the senior auditors for Obsidian Holdings. They wore identical charcoal gray suits and exuded an aura of pure clinical calculation. Their laptops were open, displaying complex amortization schedules and risk assessment matrices. They looked up, visibly annoyed by the sudden, uninvited intrusion. "We are expecting a client," the older auditor stated. He did not look up from his screen. His voice was sharp and dismissive, accustomed to dictating strict terms to desperate borrowers. "You have the wrong room." "I have the exact right room," I replied. I walked the length of the table. The rhythmic click of my heels against the hardwood floor echoed loudly in the cavernous space. I took a seat directly across from them. "You are waiting for David. You are preparing to underwrite a high-interest bridge loan collateralized by a residential estate on the inlet. He promised you a clean title by tomorrow morning." The younger auditor closed his laptop halfway. His eyes narrowed, assessing the threat. "Who are you?" "I am the primary lien holder," I said. I opened my portfolio and slid the certified deed of trust across the smooth mahogany table. It stopped precisely between them. "I highly recommend you read the recorded date on the second page. The property is heavily encumbered. My limited liability company holds a six-figure security interest against it. David does not own the asset. His wife does not own the asset. My parents cannot legally transfer the deed to them without satisfying my debt in full." The older man picked up the heavy parchment. His eyes scanned the dense legal text, noting the municipal recording seal and the strict severability clauses. His clinical demeanor shifted instantly. He recognized an airtight financial instrument when he saw one. He looked back at me, calculating the new risk variables. "He assured our underwriting department the title would be cleared by close of business today," the older auditor said. His tone lost its dismissive edge. He claimed the current lien was an informal familial dispute that was being dropped voluntarily. I slid the second stack of documents across the table. "I am not dropping anything. I am preparing to foreclose. The papers you are holding contain the public dockets for his failing development firm. He is facing multiple commercial foreclosures across the valley. He is drowning in unpaid contractor invoices. He is attempting to secure your capital under entirely false pretenses to cover a catastrophic personal deficit." The younger man picked up the bankruptcy filings. The silence in the boardroom stretched tight. These shadow lenders survived by avoiding prolonged legal battles over disputed collateral. They wanted easy leverage, not a decade of toxic litigation in federal court. I watched the realization dawn on their faces. They were being led into a blind trap by a desperate, insolvent broker. "And the final page," I said, pointing to the cyber intrusion logs documents, "a recent incident of federal wire fraud committed by his spouse. She attempted to forge a release of my deed using electronic means. The authorities will be involved very soon. If Obsidian Holdings funds this loan today, you will be injecting your capital directly into an active criminal investigation. Your firm will be subpoenaed. Your corporate assets will be frozen pending a federal inquiry. The older auditor did not say another word. He did not ask for further clarification or attempt to argue. Shadow lenders operate on a strict mathematical metric of risk versus reward. The risk had just multiplied into an unacceptable corporate liability. He dropped the documents back onto the table as if they were infected. He looked at his younger colleague and gave a single curt nod. They unhooked their laptops from the power outlets. They gathered their proprietary term sheets and shoved them into their bags. The room filled with the sharp, synchronized snap of their leather briefcases closing in unison. It was a crisp, defining sound. It signaled the instant, permanent death of his final financial rescue plan. They stood up and walked toward the exit without offering a single polite goodbye. I remained seated, listening to their footsteps fade down the hallway. Less than 5 minutes later, the boardroom door opened again. David walked in. He was wearing his signature tailored suit, but his tie was slightly skewed. His face was flushed red from the freezing wind outside. He carried a leather folder tucked tightly under his arm, holding the fraudulent paperwork he intended to submit. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at the empty ergonomic chairs. He looked at the disconnected power cords resting on the table. Then he looked at me, sitting alone at the far end of the long mahogany table. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow shell. He knew instantly that his shadow funding was gone. The predatory equity lifeline had been severed. "The meeting is canceled, David," I said quietly. My voice was devoid of malice or triumph. It was simply a cold statement of fact. You are out of options. David did not shout. He did not try to intimidate me. The realization of his total financial ruin crushed the remaining fight right out of him. He turned around and walked out of the suite, leaving the door wide open. His footsteps were heavy and slow. I packed my documents back into my portfolio and prepared to return to my office. The financial avenues were now entirely blocked. My sister and her husband were trapped with nowhere left to run. But I knew my parents would refuse to accept defeat gracefully. When conventional theft and financial leverage failed, cornered people resort to the darkest weapons in their arsenal. They would try to use the power of the state against me. They would summon protective agencies and hurl false accusations to destroy my career and my freedom. The real danger was just beginning. The failure of the shadow equity loan sent a shockwave through my family structure. I spent Friday morning at my corporate logistics hub reviewing maritime freight manifests. The office was quiet, the kind of tense, fragile quiet that settles right before a storm makes landfall. I knew Richard and Helen were out of conventional options. The banks had locked David out, the shadow lenders had fled, my parents could not shame me into submission, and they could not outmaneuver my legal fortifications. When cornered people run out of money and influence, they reach for the most dangerous weapon available. They reach for the power of the state. At 10 in the morning, my office phone buzzed. It was my executive assistant standing at the reception desk, just outside my glass suite. Her voice trembled slightly. She managed complex international shipping disputes every single day, but she sounded unnerved. "Emma, there is someone here to see you," she said softly. "A state investigator." She flashed a badge. "Send her in," I replied. I did not stand up. I kept my posture relaxed and my hands resting flat on the mahogany desk. A woman walked through the heavy glass door. She wore a utilitarian gray trench coat over a sensible navy suit. She carried a battered leather messenger bag strapped across her shoulder. Her face was lined with the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from years of navigating broken family dynamics and bureaucratic red tape. "Ms. Johnson," the woman said, "I am Agent Russo with the Alaska Department of Health and Social Services, specifically the Adult Protective Services Division." She did not offer to shake my hand. She pulled a clipboard from her satchel and stood rigid in the center of my office. The implications of her presence were severe. I am a senior director for a global supply chain. My position requires strict corporate compliance annual federal background checks and an unblemished fiduciary record. A formal investigation into financial crimes could trigger an automatic suspension pending an internal audit. My parents knew this. They were trying to detonate a bomb underneath my career. We received an emergency complaint this morning regarding your parents, Richard and Helen, Agent Russo continued. Her tone was clinical and practiced. The report alleges severe elder financial exploitation. It claims you are holding their primary residence hostage, restricting their access to their own equity, and using coercive tactics to control their retirement assets against their will. These are serious allegations. Elder abuse is a felony in this state. The betrayal was breathtaking. My parents were willing to fabricate a felony charge and risk sending their own daughter to federal prison just to secure a cash lifeline for my sister. They were weaponizing the protective agencies designed to shield vulnerable seniors, twisting those resources to execute a coordinated theft. Agent Russo unclipped a piece of paper from her board and slid it across my desk. The complainant submitted a written statement to our office. I need you to read this and respond on the record. I looked down at the document. It was not a sterile digital form. It was a sheet of heavy, cream-colored cardstock, bearing my mother's personalized monogram at the top. Helen had handwritten the complaint using her looping, elegant cursive. I scanned the paragraphs. The letter was a masterpiece of manufactured victimhood. She described herself and my father as frail, defenseless seniors, being financially starved by a greedy corporate daughter. She used theatrical phrases, claiming they were held captive in their own golden years and begging the state to intervene before they lost the roof over their heads. I looked up from the cardstock. Agent Russo was watching me closely. I noticed a subtle shift in her expression. Her eyes darted from the opulent corporate surroundings of my suite down to the dramatic monogram stationery resting on my desk. A heavy, weary sigh escaped her lips. She gave a very subtle, exhausted eye roll. In that fleeting micro-expression, I understood everything. Agent Russo dealt with genuine tragedies every day. She investigated seniors who were truly neglected, abandoned in freezing apartments, and robbed by predatory caretakers. Now she was standing in a high-rise executive suite, reading a theatrical plea written on expensive boutique stationery by a woman who regularly hosted charity galas. Russo suspected she was being manipulated. She just needed the documentation to prove it. I did not offer a defensive explanation. I did not raise my voice or act indignant. I treated the state investigator exactly like a maritime auditor reviewing a shipping ledger. I said, keeping my voice low and steady, I understand you have a statutory obligation to investigate every claim. Let me make your job very easy today. I unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick, pristine binder. I had assembled it the night Sarah attempted her cyber intrusion, knowing a formal escalation was inevitable. I placed the binder on the mahogany surface and opened it to the first tab. My parents are not financial hostages, I explained. They are attempting to fraudulently transfer a heavily encumbered asset to my brother-in-law David, who is currently facing catastrophic commercial insolvency. I am simply blocking the transfer because I hold a recorded security interest on the property. I turned the page. The first document was a certified copy of the promissory note and the deed of trust signed by Richard 12 years ago, bearing the raised municipal seal. This is the original loan agreement, I said. They faced a tax foreclosure a decade ago. I cleared their deficit. In exchange, my father signed this commercial lien tying the debt to the Cook Inlet estate. He has never made a single payment toward the principal or the accrued interest. Agent Russo leaned forward. She inspected the signatures and the notary stamp. Her professional skepticism began to thaw, replaced by sharp analytical focus. I flipped to the second tab. It contained 144 consecutive months of municipal property tax receipts. Furthermore, I continued, my limited liability company has paid the property taxes on their estate for 12 years. I have ensured they never lost the roof over their heads. They live in that house entirely expense-free because I subsidize their existence. Russo traced her finger down the long column of cleared tax payments. The sheer volume of financial support documented on those pages instantly shattered Helen's narrative of elder abuse. The state was not looking at a victimized senior citizen. The state was looking at a chronic grifter trying to erase a legitimate debt. But I did not stop there. I turned to the third and final tab. It was time to deliver the lethal blow. The reason they filed this false police report today is because their previous attempts to steal the property failed, I stated. This includes a recent attempt to forge a digital release of this exact deed. I presented the cybersecurity logs printed from our corporate honeypot server. The pages detailed the specific internet protocol address, the geographic location, and the unique device identification numbers tracing the unauthorized intrusion directly to Sarah's residential network. 2 nights ago, my sister committed federal wire fraud in an attempt to erase this lien, I told the investigator. When the digital theft failed, my brother-in-law attempted to secure a shadow equity loan using the estate as collateral. I blocked that funding yesterday morning. Calling your office was their last desperate maneuver. They are using your department as a pawn in an inheritance dispute to cover up a trail of financial fraud. Agent Russo stood in silence. She closed the heavy binder. The weariness in her face deepened, hardening into rigid professional irritation. She realized the state resources she desperately needed for actual victims had been hijacked by a wealthy family looking for a free legal loophole. Ms. Johnson Russo said, her tone entirely devoid of suspicion now. I have seen family members do terrible things to one another over real estate, but weaponizing this agency to facilitate a fraudulent transfer is a new level of audacity. She picked up Helen's monogrammed complaint and shoved it harshly back into her battered leather satchel. I am closing this investigation immediately, Russo declared. The allegations of elder financial exploitation are unsubstantiated. I will be filing a formal note in their permanent record indicating that this department was contacted under false pretenses. If they attempt to call Adult Protective Services again, they will face fines for filing a fraudulent report. Thank you, Agent Russo, I said. She turned and walked out of my office, the heavy glass door sealed shut behind her. The severe threat to my career vanished as quickly as it had arrived. I sat alone in the quiet suite, listening to the distant hum of the harbor traffic outside my window. I had successfully repelled a state-level attack my defenses were holding, but my analytical mind refused to relax. My parents had proven they possessed no moral boundaries. They were willing to risk my freedom and my corporate standing to save Sarah. As long as Richard and Helen held the primary title to the Cook Inlet estate, they would continue to search for loopholes. They would find another shadow lender, another crooked attorney, or another desperate scheme to liquidate the land. Holding a lien was no longer enough. A lien was just a financial blockade. I needed a structural lock. I needed to find a legal mechanism that permanently stripped their ability to transfer the property to anyone outside my control. I opened a new tab on my dual monitors and logged into the Anchorage County Archives. I started digging into the historical architecture of the coastal properties. I traced the title history back past my parents' acquisition, searching through decades of zoning permits and subdivision maps. The answer was buried deep in the foundational documents from the 1980s. It was time to unearth the original subdivision plat and close the cage on my family for good. The state investigator left my office and took the immediate threat with her, but a defensive victory is still just defense. I sat at my desk looking at the sprawling digital map of the Pacific shipping lanes. In logistics, you do not secure a cargo route by merely swatting away pirates. You secure it by building an impenetrable corridor. My recorded deed of trust was a strong shield, but Richard and Helen were relentless. They would keep looking for a desperate backdoor to liquidate the Cook Inlet estate. I needed to turn that shield into a vault. I needed a structural lock. I picked up my phone and called Elise. Elise is married to my estranged brother. My brother walked away from the family a decade ago to escape the endless financial drama, leaving Elise and me as the only remaining tether between our respective islands of sanity. She works as a forensic accountant for a corporate auditing firm downtown. She possesses a mind like a steel trap and a deep intolerance for manipulation. Elise had been the one to warn me about my father's secret title company inquiries. She understood the stakes. "Meet me at the municipal archives," I told her when she answered. "We need to dig into the bedrock." An hour later, I stood in the basement of the Anchorage County Courthouse. The archives are located 2 floors below street level. It is a sterile, windowless cavern filled with rows of high-density mobile shelving units. The air down there is heavy and stagnant. It carries a dry, metallic smell of old parchment and dust. It is the scent of buried secrets and binding agreements. There is a quiet, undeniable power in historical truth. While my family traded in rumors and theatrical emotions, I was standing in a room built entirely out of verified facts. Elise was already sitting at a long oak table reviewing a stack of beige folders. She wore a tailored gray suit, and her glasses rested near the tip of her nose. "I pulled the original subdivision plat maps from 1984, Elise said without looking up. "Your parents bought the lot from the primary developer before the foundation was even poured. If there is a restriction on the land use or transfer rights, it will be buried in the foundational covenants." I pulled up a chair next to her. We spent the next 2 hours combing through dense legal jargon. We read through municipal zoning codes, environmental setback requirements, and archaic homeowner association bylaws. My eyes grew tired from deciphering the faded typewritten print. We were looking for a needle in a bureaucratic haystack. My parents always viewed the estate as their personal kingdom. They assumed ownership granted them unlimited authority to dispose of the asset however they saw fit. But real estate in affluent coastal subdivisions is rarely that simple. Developers write complex rules to protect the prestige of the neighborhood. Elise suddenly stopped turning pages. She placed her index finger halfway down a yellow document. Her posture straightened. "Emma," she murmured, tracing the line of text, "read this paragraph, Article 7, Section 4. I leaned over and focused on the faded ink. It was a restrictive covenant regarding property succession. The original developer wanted to ensure the Cook Inlet lots remained within the founding families, rather than being sold off to commercial investors or transient buyers. "It is a right of first refusal clause," Elise explained, her voice dropping to a focused whisper. "The covenant dictates that any transfer of the deed outside the immediate bloodline requires the current owner to offer the property to all other immediate blood relatives first." I read the text again. The legal mechanism was clear. If my parents tried to sell or gift the house to a non-relative, they legally had to offer it to me first. "But Sarah is blood," I pointed out. "Transferring the house to my sister does not trigger this clause." Elise smiled. It was a sharp, clinical smile. "Sarah is blood, but David is not." She pulled a fresh legal pad from her briefcase and grabbed a pen. "Your sister and her husband operate under a joint financial structure. They share bank accounts, tax filings, and legal liabilities. They live in a state that recognizes commingled assets. If your parents transfer that deed into Sarah's name, the property automatically becomes a shared marital asset. David gains an immediate equitable interest." I stared at the yellowed parchment, the pieces of the trap locked together with brutal efficiency. Because David gains ownership rights, transferring the deed to Sarah legally constitutes a transfer outside the immediate bloodline, I concluded. The transaction violates the covenant unless they offer the property to me first. "Exactly," Elise said, tapping the pen against the table. "And look at the specific language regarding the purchase price." I read the next sentence on the faded page. "The property must be offered to the blood relative at current fair market value minus any existing recorded encumbrances." My breath caught in my throat. This was the final lock. It was a historically unbreakable barrier. "If they try to transfer the house to Sarah, they must offer it to you first, Elise," detailed her tone, humming with triumph. "The current market value of the estate is roughly $2 million, but you hold a recorded deed of trust with 12 years of accrued high-yield interest. Your encumbrance eats up almost the entire equity of the house. Under this covenant, you have the legal right to purchase the family estate for pennies." The magnitude of the discovery settled over the quiet archive table. The walls had officially closed in on my parents and my sister. They could not use a secret notary. They could not use a shadow equity firm. They could not use adult protective services. And even if they found a crooked title agent willing to ignore my loan, this foundational covenant would invalidate the transfer the moment they filed the paperwork. The estate was locked in a legal vice. We took the foundational documents to the archive clerk. We paid the municipal fee and requested 3 certified copies bearing the official county watermark. I held the heavy paper in my hands. The dry, metallic smell of the dust felt like the scent of ultimate victory. My parents had built their entire identity on the illusion of control. I had just dismantled their kingdom using the very paper it was built upon. I thanked Elise and walked out of the courthouse into the freezing afternoon air. I drove back to my office and drafted a very short, formal letter. I did not include any emotional appeals or angry accusations. I simply stated that I had uncovered the original subdivision plat. I explained the legal mechanics of the commingled asset transfer and the right of first refusal. I attached a certified copy of the covenant and sent the package to my parents via overnight courier. I wanted them to read the fatal blow in black and white. I wanted them to realize that their legal and financial roots were entirely dead. The package would arrive at their doorstep by the following morning. I knew Richard and Helen would read it and finally understand they were beaten. But Sarah was a different entity. Sarah operated on entitlement and rage. When the legal doors slammed shut in her face, she would not accept defeat. She would seek revenge. If she could not steal the property in the shadows, she would try to burn my life down in the light. She would turn to the court of public opinion. She would trade the courtroom for a digital stage and attempt to destroy me in front of a live audience. The conflict was about to leave the quiet archives and erupt onto the chaotic battleground of social media. The courier tracking application on my desktop confirmed the legal package was delivered at 9 on Friday morning. I waited for the inevitable explosive phone call from my father. It never came. The silence stretching over the weekend was unnatural. It was the quiet recession of the tide right before a tsunami hits the shoreline. They were digesting the right of first refusal covenant. They were staring at the reality that their legal and financial roots were entirely dead. Monday morning brought a new kind of noise. My corporate public relations director stepped into my glass suite looking pale. He bypassed the usual pleasantries and handed me a digital tablet. The screen displayed a major social media platform. Sarah had taken the war out of the shadows and thrust it onto the brightest stage she could find. She was appealing to the court of public opinion. I tapped the screen and watched the performance unfold. Sarah sat at her custom marble kitchen island. She wore a simple gray sweater. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a messy knot. It was a carefully curated aesthetic of exhaustion and despair. She stared directly into the camera lens. Her eyes were red-rimmed and glistening. She spoke with a trembling voice recounting a fabricated nightmare. She told thousands of strangers that her older sister, a wealthy, ruthless logistics executive, was using obscure legal loopholes to steal their elderly parents' home. She described Helen and Richard as terrified, vulnerable seniors packing their belongings into cardboard boxes. She painted a picture of a broken family destroyed by corporate greed. She did not mention her husband's insolvency. She did not mention the forged cyber documents. She sold a pure, unadulterated tragedy. The algorithmic response was swift and brutal. The video struck a raw nerve within the local community. It tapped into the universal resentment against corporate monopolies and wealthy elites. Within hours, the view count climbed into the hundreds of thousands. The digital mob formed with terrifying speed. My professional email inbox flooded with hateful messages. Anonymous callers tied up the fishery switchboard demanding my immediate resignation. Local business forums reposted the video with inflammatory captions. The PR director stood in front of my desk, sweating, advising me to release a defensive statement. He wanted to draft a cease and desist letter. He suggested a counter video explaining the recorded deed of trust and the historical subdivision covenants to clear my name. I handed the tablet back to him. I declined his strategy. Arguing with a digital mob is a losing proposition. It validates the spectacle. When you defend yourself against a fabricated narrative in public, you grant the liar equal footing. I do not engage in public screaming matches. I operate in boardrooms where consequences are tangible, measurable, and permanent. I needed to strike the foundation of her identity. Sarah did not care about the Cook Inlet estate. She only cared about the money because the money funded her status. Her entire self-worth was tethered to her social standing among the Anchorage elite. She spent her days at the Coastal Country Club playing tennis, attending charity luncheons, and judging women who possessed less wealth. The club was her sanctuary. It was a gated fortress where admission required impeccable financial credentials and pristine social standing. I opened the municipal court database on my dual monitors. David's preliminary bankruptcy filings were now unsealed public records. The dockets detailed the unpaid mechanics liens, the commercial foreclosures, and the severe allegations of misappropriated client funds. I printed the entire unsealed file. The stack of paper was thick and heavy, with irrefutable facts. I placed the documents into a plain manila envelope. I did not include a return address. I did not include an explanatory note. The documents spoke for themselves. I hired a private courier and directed the delivery straight to the chairman of the country club admissions and disciplinary board. Private clubs exist to shield their members from scandal. They possess strict, unforgiving bylaws regarding financial insolvency and moral turpitude. If a member faces public bankruptcy or fraud allegations, the board moves with swift, lethal efficiency to amputate the liability. They protect the brand above all else. They do not tolerate the stench of financial decay in their dining rooms. I went back to reviewing my maritime shipping ledgers. 2 hours later, my personal cell phone illuminated with a text message from Elise. Elise was having lunch at an upscale bistro downtown. She had a front-row seat to the fallout. She texted me the play-by-play as the scene unfolded. Sarah was sitting 2 tables away from Elise, basking in the warm glow of her viral victimhood. She was drinking a $12 latte, swiping through the thousands of sympathetic comments on her phone. Her screen provided a constant stream of external validation. She was smiling, soaking in the praise of strangers who called her brave for speaking out. Then, the notification rhythm changed. The phone buzzed relentlessly against the marble cafe table, a harsh, continuous vibration that cut through the ambient jazz music playing in the bistro. Elise watched Sarah pick up the device. The triumphant smile vanished from my sister's face instantly. The screen illuminated with a direct email from the country club secretary. The subject line was flagged with high importance. The board of directors requested her immediate resignation to avoid a formal expulsion hearing. Her gate access card was deactivated. Her dining privileges were permanently suspended. The private sanctuary she worshipped had locked her out. Another buzz followed a few seconds later. It was an automated email from the local charity gala committee, quietly removing her from the winter planning board. The social architecture she had spent a decade building collapsed in a matter of seconds. The digital mob could offer her empty sympathy, but they could not grant her access to the velvet-roped rooms she desperately craved. Her currency had expired. The panic must have been suffocating. Sitting in that upscale cafe, Sarah realized someone was leaking her husband's catastrophic financial ruin to the people who mattered most. She understood that if she continued to draw attention to herself, the scrutiny would only intensify. If she kept playing the victim on camera, the reality of her husband's pending federal fraud indictments would become headline news. 10 minutes after the country club revoked her membership, the viral video vanished. My PR director refreshed the page on his tablet. The link returned a blank error screen. Sarah had deleted the post. She deactivated her public profile entirely. She amputated her own digital campaign to stop the bleeding, realizing the real-world consequences were far too devastating to endure. The social media retaliation was dead. My corporate inbox quieted. The anonymous phone calls to the fishery switchboard trickled to a halt. The PR director breathed a heavy sigh of relief and returned to his department. I remained at my mahogany desk, knowing the silence in the office was only a temporary reprieve. I had stripped my family of their legal avenues. I had blocked their shadow funding. I had dismantled their social standing. They were out of clever tricks and manipulative schemes. They had nothing left to lose. David was a desperate man facing total ruin. A cornered predator stripped of his tailored suit and his charming facade does not retreat peacefully. He lashes out with whatever blunt instrument he can find. He would stop trying to fight me with lawyers, rumors, and digital videos. He would attempt to strike the physical source of my power. He would target my logistics network. He would bring the war directly to the freezing shipping docks, using physical intimidation to force my hand. The battle was about to leave the clean corporate boardrooms and spill out onto the industrial concrete. The delete button on Sarah's social media account did not solve the root problem. It only compressed the panic into a smaller, tighter container. David was out of time. His institutional creditors were circling his development firm like wolves scenting blood on the snow. He could not secure the shadow equity loan. He could not sell the Cook Inlet estate. He was backed into a corner where logic perishes and primal instinct takes over. On Tuesday morning, the storm broke inside the ground floor lobby of my corporate logistics hub. I was stepping out of the executive elevator when the shouting started. The acoustic panels in the grand foyer usually absorbed the ambient noise of the shipping brokers and receptionists, but they could not dampen the raw, desperate frequency of a man losing his mind. David stood near the security turnstiles. He wore the same custom suit from the previous week, but the fabric looked rumpled. His tie was missing. The designer cologne he used to mask his anxiety had evaporated, leaving only the harsh metallic scent of fear and unwashed adrenaline. He was screaming at the head security guard, demanding access to my suite. I did not retreat into the elevator. I walked straight toward the commotion. My heels tapped a steady, calm rhythm against the polished concrete floor. Emma David yelled when he saw me approach. He shoved past the guard and marched into the center of the lobby. His face was flushed a dangerous dark red. The remaining corporate staff froze in their tracks, watching the spectacle unfold. "You think you are untouchable," David snarled, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "You sit up in your ivory tower playing God with our lives. You shut down my funding. You ruined my wife. I am going to tear this place apart. I will drag your name through every regulatory commission in this state. I will make sure you lose everything, just like you are making me lose everything." He stepped uncomfortably close. I could see the bloodshot veins in his eyes. He was trying to use physical proximity to force a reaction. He wanted me to flinch. He wanted me to call the police so he could play the victim of a corporate giant. I looked at the security guard and gave a subtle shake of my head. "Stand down." I turned my attention back to my brother-in-law. "David," I said, keeping my volume low enough that he had to lean in to hear me, "you are shouting in a room full of people who manage global supply lines. We negotiate with offshore pirates and sovereign dock strikes. A bankrupt real estate broker having a temper tantrum in the lobby does not intimidate us. It just looks pathetic." His jaw clenched tight enough to crack a tooth. He raised his hand as if to point a finger at my chest. "If you raise your voice again," I stated with icy precision, "I will not call the authorities. I will simply call the primary lender holding the note on your Matanuska-Susitna Valley Plaza and inform them you are currently harassing executives instead of securing their repayment. Now turn around and walk out the front door." David lowered his hand. He looked around the lobby. The analysts and brokers were watching him with cold, clinical disdain. He was not a terrifying predator. He was a nuisance. He spun on his heel and stormed out into the freezing Alaskan morning, kicking the heavy revolving door on his way out. The physical intimidation failed, but the encounter crystallized a harsh reality in my mind. Blocking his path was no longer sufficient. As long as he possessed a shred of operational infrastructure, he would continue to view me as an obstacle to be destroyed. I needed to shift from defense to active offense. I needed to paralyze his remaining cash flow and starve his firm into permanent submission. I returned to my fourth-floor suite and locked the door. I sat at my dual monitors and opened the proprietary database for my logistics network. True power does not involve screaming in public lobbies. True power operates invisibly. It moves through fiber optic cables and encrypted ledgers. I control the supply chain data for the Western Seaboard. I know every major commercial contractor, building materials supplier, and transport union in the region. David still had 2 minor retail renovation projects staggering along on the edge of town. They were his final viable assets. If he finished them, he could generate enough revenue to keep his firm breathing for another month. He relied on local suppliers for lumber, steel framing, and electrical conduit. I cross-referenced his active project sites with my regional vendor index. I compiled a list of the specific material providers currently extending him 30-day credit terms. I did not make a single phone call. I did not leave a voice trace. I used an anonymous encrypted routing server to dispatch a series of automated data packets. I sent the vendors verified copies of the unsealed municipal bankruptcy filings, the active mechanic liens, and the notices of default tied directly to his development firm. I provided the raw, undeniable math of his insolvency. In the construction industry, credit is fragile. When a supplier learns a contractor is defaulting on other projects, the 30-day payment grace period vanishes instantly. I spent the afternoon auditing offshore cargo manifests while my digital seeds took root across the city. By 3 o'clock, the harvest began. My industry contacts forwarded me the fallout. The regional steel supplier sent David an immediate stop work order. They refused to deliver the framing materials for his retail project unless he provided a certified bank draft covering the entire invoice up front. An hour later, the electrical union pulled their crews from his job sites, citing credible concerns regarding unpaid wages. The lumberyard froze his purchasing account. The squeeze was targeted, silent, and flawlessly executed. I severed his logistical arteries without ever leaving my ergonomic chair. Elise texted me an update later that evening. She had driven past his downtown firm. The lights in his leased office space were off. The final blow arrived on Wednesday morning. I tapped into the telecom data routing through the municipal grid. It is a secondary perk of managing broad logistics networks. You learn how to monitor the traffic volume of specific commercial nodes. I pulled the call volume metric for David's real estate brokerage. The graph on my screen told a profound story. A week ago, his phone lines buzzed continuously with eager investors, hopeful contractors, and ambitious partners. Today, the digital chart displayed a flat line. The eerie silence of his phone was the ultimate testament to my sweeping, invisible control. His former business partners universally stopped returning his calls. The private equity sharks ignored him. The material suppliers blocked his number. David was left isolated in a frozen city. He could not move materials, he could not hire labor, he could not borrow a single dime. He was financially paralyzed. The illusion of his boundless wealth shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. I leaned back and sipped my dark roast coffee. The board was cleared, the hostile pieces were removed from play. The Cook Inlet estate remained securely locked beneath my historical covenant and my recorded deed of trust. I expected the victory to feel final. I expected my family to retreat into their shame and accept the consequences of their spectacular failure. But I underestimated the depth of the rot hiding beneath their desperate actions. The silence stretching across Wednesday afternoon was broken by the sound of my home doorbell ringing long after sunset. I checked the security camera feed on my smartphone. It was not a process server. It was not a screaming brother-in-law. It was my mother. Helen stood on my front porch, shivering in the harsh winter wind. She was entirely alone. Her designer coat looked thin and inadequate against the Alaskan cold. The pristine theatrical elegance she wielded at the hospital was gone. She looked broken, terrified, and out of time. The war over the estate was never just about favoritism. It was a cover story. And as I walked toward the front door to let her in, I realized I was about to learn the ugly, undeniable truth about why they were willing to risk everything to liquidate that land. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy front door open. The winter wind pushed past my mother, carrying the bitter scent of frost and dead leaves into my foyer. She stood on the welcome mat, shivering. Her hair, usually sprayed into a flawless architectural structure for charity luncheons, hung flat and damp against her cheeks. The designer wool coat she wore looked expensive but incredibly thin, offering zero protection against the brutal Alaskan elements. I stepped aside. She walked into the entryway without saying a single word. We moved toward the kitchen. My house is a modern sanctuary of steel and dark wood. It is a space I built utilizing my own income, free from family influence or secret leverage. I directed her toward a tall stool at the granite island. She climbed onto the seat, moving with the slow, rigid caution of someone carrying a severe physical injury. I turned my back to her and began brewing coffee. The kitchen was quiet, filled only by the mechanical hum of the espresso machine and the rhythmic tapping of the sleet against the skylight above us. I poured the dark liquid into a ceramic mug and placed it on the counter directly in front of her. Helen wrapped both of her hands around the warm mug. I stood on the opposite side of the granite island and watched her. Her perfectly manicured fingernails, painted a pristine pale pink, contrasted sharply with the erratic trembling of her fingers. Her hands shook so intensely that the lukewarm coffee sloshed against the ceramic rim, spilling small, dark droplets onto the polished stone countertop. Her pristine facade was shattered by whatever reality she was carrying. "Emma," my mother whispered. Her voice was stripped of the condescending maternal authority she had wielded my entire life. It was fragile and raw. "We are out of time." I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. "Out of time for what, Mom?" She stared down at the dark liquid in her mug. The tears started to fall, cutting through her carefully applied makeup. "It was never about giving Sarah a better life," she confessed. "It was never about picking favorites or ensuring your sister had a nice house to host parties. We were trying to build a firewall." I narrowed my eyes. A firewall against what? "David is not just bankrupt." Helen sobbed the words, pouring out in a panicked rush. He did not just lose his money in bad commercial investments. He stole capital. He managed large escrow accounts for his real estate clients. When his own development projects faltered last year, he started siphoning cash from his clients' trust funds to cover his personal margins. He told us he just needed a temporary bridge to finish a retail plaza. He swore he would return the funds before the quarterly audits. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together, forming a horrifying picture in my analytical mind. David was running a classic Ponzi maneuver. He was using fresh client deposits to pay off old commercial debts. The market turned. Helen continued, her shoulders heaving with every breath. The retail permits were denied. The construction stalled. Now his clients are demanding their capital back to close their own deals. David cannot produce the cash. The federal regulatory agencies have noticed the discrepancies. They have opened an official inquiry into his brokerage firm. Federal investigators are auditing his ledgers this very second. The true motive finally stepped out of the shadows. The entire inheritance dispute was a giant red herring. My parents did not care about giving Sarah a beautiful estate on the inlet. They needed the property deed transferred into her name so David could immediately leverage it to a predatory shadow lender. They needed a massive injection of untraceable liquidity to replace the stolen escrow funds before the federal investigators issued subpoenas. If he cannot replace that money by the end of the month, Helen wept, the federal prosecutors will issue indictments. They are looking at wire fraud, grand larceny, and embezzlement. He will spend decades in a federal penitentiary. I looked at the woman sitting across from me. She was begging me to surrender my 12-year investment to clean up a felony. If David broke the law, David deserves the consequences, I stated. My voice remained level, betraying none of the shock reverberating through my chest. Why are you willing to sacrifice your own home and my financial security to save a thief? Because of your sister, Helen cried out, lifting her head to meet my gaze. Her eyes were wide with terror. Sarah signed the joint tax returns. David listed her as a corporate officer on his primary holding companies to maximize their deductions. She enjoyed the imported cars and the country club memberships funded by that stolen money. Ignorance is not a valid legal defense in federal court. If David falls, the prosecutors will drag Sarah down with him as a co-conspirator. She will go to prison, Emma. The silence in the kitchen became suffocating. The stakes of this war had escalated far beyond a simple civil dispute over a deed of trust. This was no longer about stopping a greedy brother-in-law from liquidating a house. This was a profound moral dilemma resting squarely on my shoulders. I looked at my mother. I thought about the decades I spent playing the responsible glass child. I paid their property taxes. I built a bulletproof career in supply chain logistics. I accumulated my wealth through relentless, exhausting labor. My family treated me like a disposable utility, mocking my dedication, while they celebrated Sarah's empty, superficial lifestyle. Now the bill for that superficial lifestyle had arrived. Helen slid off the tall stool. She walked around the granite island and dropped to her knees on the hardwood floor right in front of me. She grabbed my hands. Her palms were freezing cold and wet with spilled coffee. "Please," my mother begged, her voice echoing off the stainless steel appliances, "please drop the lien. Release the deed so we can secure the equity loan. We can replace the stolen escrow funds and make this entire nightmare go away. Save your sister. I am begging you to save our family." I stared down at the woman who raised me. She was kneeling at my feet, asking me to burn down my own financial fortress to protect a criminal enterprise. If I released the deed, I would lose the hundreds of thousands of dollars I had invested into their estate. I would be rewarding their deception, their cyber attacks, and their vicious social smears. But if I held the line, my own sister would likely be indicted by the federal government. She would be stripped of her freedom, locked in a concrete cell, and branded a felon for the rest of her life. I gently pulled my hands out of my mother's grasp. I took a step back. "Stand up, Mom," I said quietly. Helen struggled to her feet, wiping the tears from her face. She looked at me with desperate, hopeful eyes, waiting for me to concede. She believed her ultimate display of vulnerability would finally break my logic. She believed my innate human empathy would override my corporate boundaries. "I cannot give you an answer tonight," I told her. "I need time to process this information." Helen nodded frantically. Okay, yes, just think about it, Emma. Think about what is at stake. We can fix this if we just work together. I walked her to the front door and watched her drive away into the freezing Alaskan night. I locked the deadbolt and turned off the porch light. I returned to the kitchen and poured her cold, spilled coffee down the sink. My mind operated with cold, mechanical precision, analyzing the data points of her confession. Helen had revealed the truth, but the timing of her visit bothered me. Desperate people do not leave a negotiation empty-handed unless they are playing a larger game. Her tears were real. The threat of federal prison was genuine. But her visit was not just a plea for mercy. It was a softening tactic. My parents knew that sending Helen alone to cry on my kitchen floor would destabilize my emotions. They wanted me feeling confused, guilty, and morally conflicted. They wanted my defenses lowered for the final phase of their strategy. They knew a single emotional conversation would not force me to sign away a multi-million-dollar asset. They were setting the stage for a coordinated attack. I walked into my home office and opened my laptop. I pulled up the contact information for the federal regulatory agency overseeing commercial real estate brokers in the state of Alaska. I needed to verify the status of the investigation into David's firm. I needed raw, undeniable facts before the rest of my family arrived to force my hand. The confession cleared the red herring, but it also signaled the beginning of the end. My family was out of time, out of money, and facing federal indictments. They had nothing left to lose. I knew with absolute certainty that tomorrow would bring a physical confrontation. They would gather their remaining strength, corner me in the very estate I had spent a decade paying for, and attempt to break me through sheer hostile force. The ultimate ambush was coming, and I needed to prepare a devastating counterstrike. The text message arrived on my encrypted corporate device at exactly 8 in the morning on Thursday. It contained a single terse sentence from my father: "Come to the house immediately." He did not offer a greeting. He did not ask about my schedule. The tone was an imperial summons. My mother weeping on my kitchen floor the previous night was the emotional artillery bombardment designed to weaken my defenses. This morning was the planned infantry assault. They expected me to arrive at the estate exhausted, morally conflicted, and desperate to end the suffocating tension. They expected me to surrender. I sat at my mahogany desk, watching the digital clock on my monitor tick forward. I did not feel conflicted. I felt a cold, pristine clarity. Helen had handed me the final missing variable when she confessed to the stolen escrow funds. She gave me the precise coordinates of their vulnerability. David was terrified of federal prosecutors, but the justice system moves with agonizing bureaucratic sluggishness. Investigations take months. Subpoenas require judicial approval. Indictments drag through grand juries. The authorities were auditing his ledgers, but they had not yet frozen his operational capacity. He was still maneuvering, still trying to secure a shadow loan to replace the missing capital before the federal trap closed. I knew how to close a trap much faster than the government. In global supply chain management, you learn that capital is the oxygen of any fraudulent enterprise. If you want to stop a rogue operator, you do not call the police. You can call the institutions holding their leverage. Banks do not wait for grand jury indictments to protect their money. Risk assessment algorithms operate in milliseconds. I opened a secure routing portal on my workstation. I compiled a comprehensive digital dossier. It contained the unsealed bankruptcy filings, the mechanic liens, and the undeniable mathematical proof of the siphoned trust accounts Helen had so helpfully detailed. I attached the cyber intrusion logs documenting my sister's attempted wire fraud. I cross-referenced David's commercial real estate portfolio with regional banking records. I identified the 4 primary institutional lenders providing his remaining liquidity. I drafted an anonymous, highly encrypted email addressed directly to the senior risk management directors at each of those 4 financial institutions. I did not send the transmission immediately. I set a time-delayed trigger programmed to execute the delivery precisely at 10:15. I closed my laptop, draped my heavy wool coat over my shoulders, and walked out to my vehicle. The drive to the Cook Inlet estate took 30 minutes. The coastal highway was slick with fresh ice. Gray waves crashed against the rocky bluffs below the road, churning with winter hostility. The family home sat at the end of a private, winding drive lined with towering spruce trees. It was a sprawling structure of cedar and floor-to-ceiling glass designed to project an image of untouchable generational wealth. I parked my car on the circular driveway. I walked up the slate steps and pushed the heavy oak front door open. The entryway smelled of expensive lemon polish and wood smoke from the stone fireplace. It was a carefully curated illusion of warmth, masking a foundation of rot. They were waiting for me in the sunken living room. The staging was deliberate. It looked like a tribunal. Richard stood near the hearth, with his hands clasped behind his back, projecting the authority of a patriarch. Helen sat rigid on the edge of a white leather sofa. Her hair was perfectly styled, and her makeup was flawless. The weeping, desperate mother from the night before had vanished without a trace, replaced by a cold, calculating participant. Sarah paced the perimeter of a large Persian rug, her arms crossed tight against her chest. David stood near the expansive windows, looking out at the frozen water, attempting to project an aura of quiet menace. On the center of the glass coffee table rested a single document, printed on heavy legal paper. A silver pen lay parallel to the signature line. It was a quitclaim deed. Emma Richards said, his voice echoing off the vaulted cedar ceiling. "Have a seat. We are putting an end to this today." I did not sit down. I remained standing at the edge of the sunken room, keeping the tactical high ground. I looked at the paper on the table. "Your mother spoke to you last night," Richard continued, his tone dripping with paternal condescension. "She explained the severity of the situation. We are facing a minor liquidity crisis. You have made your point. You have exercised your authority, but the games are over. You will sign that deed right now and release the property so we can execute our financial restructuring." "It is not a restructuring," I replied, my voice steady and flat. "It is a desperate attempt to cover up a felony using an asset you do not own." Sarah stopped pacing. She turned toward me, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. She unleashed a shriek that rattled the decorative crystal glasses on the wet bar. "You selfish, ungrateful machine!" Sarah screamed. She marched across the Persian rug until she stood inches away from me. Flecks of spittle caught the natural light filtering through the windows. "You have millions of dollars. You have a pristine corporate career. We are about to lose everything. If David goes down, I go down with him. You are going to sign that paper, or you are going to watch your own sister go to prison." The volume in the room escalated. The psychological pressure was designed to overwhelm my sensory processing. They wanted to force compliance through sensory overload. Helen stood up from the leather sofa. Her eyes were hard and uncompromising. "If you walk out that door without signing the release, you are no longer part of this family," she declared. "We will excise you from our history. We will disown you. You will never set foot in this house again. You will be entirely alone." I stood in the eye of their manufactured hurricane. The screaming, the threats of disownment, the weaponized guilt washed over me without leaving a single mark. I observed their flushed faces and their desperate posturing with the clinical detachment of an auditor reviewing a failed ledger. I slowly raised my left arm and pushed back the cuff of my wool coat. I looked at the stainless steel face of my wristwatch. The sweeping second hand ticked past the 12. It was 10:16. I lowered my arm and looked directly into David's bloodshot eyes. "You think you are waiting for the federal government to freeze your life?" I said, my voice slicing through the residual echoes of Sarah's screaming. "You think you have weeks to secure a shadow loan and replace the stolen escrow capital before the prosecutors secure a grand jury indictment?" David stiffened. The faux menace evaporated from his posture. He took a hesitant step away from the window. "The justice system is slow," I continued, taking a deliberate step toward the glass coffee table. I picked up the silver pen and rolled it between my fingers. "But institutional risk management algorithms are instantaneous. I did not call the police. I did not need to. I simply compiled the undeniable mathematical proof of your insolvency, your unpaid mechanics liens, and your stolen trust accounts. 15 minutes ago, I forwarded that dossier directly to the underwriting directors at your 4 primary lending banks." The silence that descended upon the living room was profound. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a localized vacuum. Sarah opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. Richard stared at me, his authoritative posture crumbling as the implications of my words processed in his mind. I dropped the silver pen onto the quitclaim deed. It landed with a sharp metallic clatter. "I targeted your oxygen supply," I told him. On a small decorative side table near the sofa, David's smartphone rested face up. The screen illuminated. A sharp, metallic chime cut through the silent room. Ping! David flinched. He stared at the device as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. Ping! Another sharp chime rang out. Then another. The notifications accelerated into a relentless, terrifying cascade of sound. Ping, ping, ping. The phone vibrated violently against the polished wood surface, inching toward the edge of the table, fueled by the rapid-fire alerts. David lunged forward and snatched the device. His hands shook with uncontrollable tremors. He swiped across the glass screen, his eyes scanning the incoming automated messages from his financial institutions. I watched the remaining color drain from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His mouth hung open, the muscles in his jaw slackened. "What is it Sarah demanded?" Her voice reduced to a terrified whisper. "David, what does it say?" He could not speak. He simply turned the phone around so she could see the screen. His credit lines were frozen. His corporate margin calls were executed. His primary checking and savings accounts were locked, pending a formal fraud investigation. The banks had severed his access to every single dollar he possessed in a matter of seconds. His entire financial empire imploded right there in the living room, dismantled by automated security protocols triggered from my desktop. The hostile intervention died. The screaming stopped. The threats of disownment evaporated into the cedar rafters. They had tried to break me with a massive theatrical ambush, and I had inverted their assault with a calculated, devastating financial counterstrike. I stood in the center of the Cook Inlet estate holding the ultimate power. They were bankrupt, exposed, and out of maneuvers. The chessboard was clear. There was only one final move left to make to secure the property and banish the toxicity from my life forever. The weeks that followed the confrontation in the living room unspooled with ruthless efficiency. The federal regulatory agencies did not hesitate. Once the institutional lenders froze the corporate accounts, the Justice Department issued their subpoenas. David was arrested on a Tuesday morning outside his leased office building. There was no dignity in his exit. He wore steel handcuffs over his tailored suit jacket, while local news cameras documented his march to the federal transport vehicle. The charges were staggering: wire fraud, embezzlement, and grand larceny. The prosecutors laid out a damning paper trail showing millions of siphoned trust funds. His financial empire was reduced to a box of evidentiary exhibits. Sarah did not escape the blast radius. Ignorance was her only defense, and federal courts do not accept chosen blindness as a valid alibi. Her signature resided on the joint tax returns and the holding company charters. The authorities seized her imported cars, her designer jewelry, and the remaining capital in her personal checking accounts to pay victim restitution. She was reduced to standing on the courthouse steps, wearing off-rack clothing, sobbing for a press corps that no longer cared about her manufactured victimhood. The golden child was tarnished beyond repair, exposed to the city as a willing participant in a criminal enterprise. Richard and Helen attempted to rescue their favorite daughter. They drained whatever liquid cash they possessed, trying to hire elite defense attorneys. They threw their remaining resources into a burning pit of legal fees and creditor crossfire. The financial strain snapped the final fragile threads holding their fabricated reality together. Without my silent monetary support shielding the estate, and with their own funds exhausted by the legal defense, the Cook Inlet property became a toxic liability they could not manage. The municipal tax authorities and secondary creditors initiated a forced public auction. The pristine cedar house on the water was placed on the county foreclosure block. The auction took place on a bitter Thursday morning on the concrete steps of the Anchorage Municipal Courthouse. The sky was the color of slate. A handful of local real estate investors showed up holding thermoses of hot coffee, hoping to acquire a luxury asset for a fraction of its market value. They did not understand the math. I stood at the back of the small crowd wearing my heavy wool coat. When the auctioneer opened the floor, my corporate attorney placed a single bid on behalf of my limited liability company. The other investors looked at the number and walked away. My recorded deed of trust, bloated with 12 years of accrued high-yield interest, offset the entire purchase price. I bought the family estate outright at a profound discount. The wooden gavel fell against the podium. I was the sole, uncontested legal owner of the legacy my parents had tried so hard to steal. I drove out to the coastal highway the following afternoon. The winter wind whipped the gray waves against the rocky bluffs below the property. I parked my vehicle on the circular driveway and walked up the slate steps. The heavy oak front door was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped into the foyer. The house smelled of cardboard and stale dust. The curated illusion of warmth was gone. Richard and Helen were in the sunken living room packing their possessions into brown moving boxes. They expected to be evicted. They expected to be thrown out into the freezing Alaskan winter with nowhere to go. Helen paused when she heard my heels tapping against the hardwood floor. She looked up from a box of porcelain dishes. Her face was gaunt, aged 10 years in the span of a single month. Richard stood near the stone hearth, holding a stack of framed photographs. His shoulders slumped. The arrogant patriarch who had tried to serve me with a predatory legal notice was entirely broken. They looked at me with hollow, defeated eyes. They possessed no leverage, no influence, and no remaining tricks. They were at my mercy. I walked to the glass coffee table in the center of the room. It was the exact spot where they had ambushed me weeks prior with a fraudulent quitclaim deed. I opened my leather portfolio and removed a thick stack of printed legal paper. I placed it on the glass surface. "I am not throwing you out onto the street," I stated. My voice was calm and measured. "You are in no financial position to secure an apartment, and I have no desire to watch you freeze. You may continue to live in this house." Helen let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hand. Richard took a tentative step forward, his eyes searching my face for the hidden trap. I tapped the thick document resting on the table. "But you no longer own this land," I continued. "I am your landlord. You will reside here under an ironclad lease agreement. The monthly rent is a nominal fee of $1. I will cover the property taxes and the structural maintenance, but the behavioral clauses are non-negotiable. If you violate a single term of this contract, my property management firm will execute a 30-day eviction notice." Richard stared at the paperwork. "What are the terms?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I looked directly into his eyes. "Section 4 dictates the authorized visitors," I explained. "Your youngest daughter and her husband are legally and permanently banned from this property. Sarah and David are not permitted to set foot on this driveway, across this threshold, or enter this structure under any circumstances. If they appear on the security cameras I am having installed tomorrow, you forfeit your right to live here. The golden child is banished. You will not host her in my home." Helen closed her eyes and let out a quiet sob of resignation. She knew she had no choice. She walked to the table, picked up a standard ballpoint pen, and signed her name on the dotted line. She handed the document to my father. Richard looked at the signature line. He reached into the breast pocket of his wool sweater and pulled out his prized possession, the vintage gold fountain pen, the same pen that had run dry when he tried to sign his threatening legal notice in the downtown boardroom. He stared at the dry nib, a painful reminder of his empty power. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small glass bottle of premium black ink. I placed it on the glass table. "I refilled it for you," I said softly. "Go ahead." Richard unscrewed the barrel of the pen, drew the fresh ink into the reservoir, and assembled it with shaking hands. He pressed the gold nib to the paper. The dark ink flowed smoothly across the page, binding him to my terms. He surrendered his kingdom with his own signature. I gathered the executed lease agreement and placed it back into my portfolio. I walked toward the front entrance, stopping at the heavy oak door. I pulled a steel screwdriver and a new brass deadbolt cylinder from my coat pocket. I knelt on the slate tile and began removing the old hardware. The cold, metallic click of the tumblers echoed in the quiet foyer. I personally extracted the old pins and installed the new locking mechanism. The rhythmic sound of the metal components sliding into place was the final percussion of the war. Richard and Helen stood in the living room watching me in total quiet submission. They did not protest. They did not offer a single word of defiance. They watched the physical manifestation of their lost control lock into place. The old keys were useless. The old era was finished. I stood up, tested the new deadbolt, and slipped the only master key into my pocket. I walked out into the freezing Alaskan afternoon and inhaled the crisp winter air. The Pacific gray waves crashed against the rocky bluffs, carving their own boundaries into the earth. I had spent my entire life acting as the disposable foundation for a family that despised my strength. I survived their legal bluffs, their cyber attacks, and their vicious social smears. I stood on the coastal driveway knowing my financial fortress was finally secure. I did not win by fighting louder. I won by building an architecture of undeniable truth, letting their lies collapse under their own weight. That is my story. True peace does not come from keeping quiet. It comes from owning the ground you stand on and changing the locks on anyone who tries to take it. There is a specific quiet tragedy that unfolds inside homes that look perfect from the outside. We spend so much time in American culture talking about the American dream building, the estate, securing the wealth, manicuring the lawn, and projecting an image of untouchable success. But we rarely pause to examine the invisible fault lines running directly beneath the foundation. The story of Emma, Sarah, Richard, and Helen is not just a tale of legal maneuvers and financial checkmates. At its core, it is a devastating mirror held up to the darkest corners of family dynamics, forcing us to ask a terrifying question. What happens when the people who are supposed to teach us about fairness and unconditional love decide that we are nothing more than a utility? Parenting is the most profound responsibility a human can undertake. In our traditional structures, we are taught that parents are the ultimate protectors, the harbor in the storm. But there is a lethal difference between protecting a child and shielding them from the consequences of their own reality. For decades, Richard and Helen operated under a toxic, unspoken parenting philosophy. They enabled the fragility of their favorite child, Sarah, while ruthlessly exploiting the competence of their resilient child, Emma. We call children like Emma glass children, the ones who are seen right through, the ones whose stability is weaponized against them. Because Emma was strong, her parents decided she did not require their honesty, their fairness, or their protection. Because Sarah was weak, they decided she was entitled to the fruits of Emma's labor. This dynamic is a silent epidemic in many households. When parents play favorites, they do not just harm the child who is left out in the cold. They actively cripple the child they are trying to protect. By constantly providing a golden parachute for Sarah, by treating her husband's financial recklessness as a family emergency that Emma was obligated to fix, Richard and Helen stole Sarah's ability to survive in the real world. They taught her that her mistakes would always be paid for by someone else's sweat. When the federal indictments finally arrived, Sarah was completely unequipped to face them because she had never been allowed to face a consequence in her life. The parents' ultimate failure was not losing the Cook Inlet estate at a public auction. Their ultimate failure happened years earlier, the first time they looked at their daughters and decided that fairness was negotiable. If there is a central pillar to providing long-term guidance for children, it is honesty. In American society, we pride ourselves on meritocracy, on the idea that hard work and ethical behavior build a lasting legacy. But a family's legacy is not comprised of cedarwood vaulted ceilings or waterfront views. A legacy is the moral architecture you leave behind in the minds of your children. When Richard and Helen chose to lie, booking a secret notary, faking a cardiac emergency in a hospital bed, and weaponizing state agencies to file a fraudulent report, they entirely abandoned their moral authority. They transformed the family structure from a place of sanctuary into a battlefield of transactional extortion. They taught their children that truth is malleable, that manipulation is a valid tool for survival, and that empathy is just another button to push to get what you want. As parents, the moment you begin lying to your children to manipulate their choices, you sever the tether of trust. Emma did not stop loving her parents the day she changed the deadbolt on the front door. That bond was broken the moment she realized her mother's tears were a calculated performance designed to steal a 12-year investment. Emotional awareness in parenting means recognizing that your children are sovereign individuals, not extensions of your own ego or resources to be mined. It requires the profound emotional maturity to admit when you are wrong, rather than doubling down on a lie to save face in front of the country club. This narrative forces us to examine our own roles within our family structures. How often do we demand that the strongest members of our families carry the heaviest burdens in silence, simply because we know they won't collapse? How often do we confuse boundary setting with betrayal? Emma's journey from the target of a hostile familial takeover to the undisputed owner of her own life is a testament to the power of holding the line. She did not raise her voice. She did not seek illicit revenge. She simply allowed the undeniable weight of the truth to crush the illusions her family had built. In raising the next generation, we must instill the value of this kind of quiet, unwavering integrity. We must teach our children that being loyal to your family does not mean setting yourself on fire to keep them warm. It does not mean signing your name to a lie to protect someone else from the prison of their own choices. True family responsibility means holding each other accountable. It means allowing a criminal to face the justice system rather than stealing from an innocent sibling to cover up a felony. It is a harsh, biting truth, but it is the only truth that prevents the rot from spreading from one generation to the next. The greatest gift Emma gave her parents wasn't the nominal lease that kept them off the street. The greatest gift she gave them was the finality of a boundary they could no longer cross. As we navigate our own lives, our own holiday dinners, and our own quiet sacrifices, we must ask ourselves which role we are playing. Are we the enablers, desperately trying to maintain an illusion of perfection while the foundation crumbles? Are we the entitled, waiting for someone else to pay the toll for our mistakes? Or are we the ones holding the line, clutching the receipts, waiting for the courage to finally change the locks? If this reflection resonated with you, if you have ever been the strong one, the quiet one, the one who was expected to give everything and ask for nothing, then you are not alone. There is a whole community of us learning how to stop apologizing for our own strength. Please take a moment to subscribe and follow the channel, Grape Echo Stories. We are dedicated to bringing you narratives that validate your boundaries, challenge toxic traditions, and remind you of your own power. Drop a comment below and share your own experiences with family dynamics. Your stories matter here. In the end, a house is just glass and wood, susceptible to the freezing rain and the passage of time. The real estate we must protect at all costs is the space within our own minds. When the storm clears and the auctioneer's gavel falls, we are left standing in the silence of our own choices. Look at the keys you carry in your pocket right now. Which doors are they opening? And more importantly, which doors is it finally time to lock